The Library of History by Diodoro Siculus, Book 14. Published in Volume 6 of the Loeb Classical Library Edition, 1954. Translated by Charles Henry Oldfather. Digitalized by Bill Thayer. Audiobook produced by Open Audio Recordings and read by Nancy, a Microsoft Azure AI neural voice. Start of Book 14. All men, perhaps naturally, are disinclined to listen to obloquies that are uttered against them. Indeed, even those whose evil-doing is in every respect so manifest that it cannot even be denied, none the less deeply resent it when they are the objects of censure and endeavor to make a reply to the accusation. Consequently, all men should take every possible care not to commit any evil deed, and those especially who aspire to leadership or have been favored by some striking gift of fortune, for since the life of such men is in all things an open book because of their distinction, it cannot conceal its own unwisdom. Let no man, therefore, who has gained some kind of preeminence, cherish the hope that, if he commits great crimes, he will for all time escape notice and go uncensured. For even if during his own lifetime he eludes the sentence of rebuke, let him expect that at a later time truth will find him out, frankly proclaiming abroad matters long hidden from mention. It is, therefore, a hard fate for wicked men that at their death they leave to posterity an undying image, so to speak, of their entire life, for even if those things that follow after death do not concern us, as certain philosophers keep chanting, nevertheless the life which has preceded death becomes far worse throughout all time for the evil memory that it enjoys. Manifest examples of this may be found by those who read the detailed story contained in this book. Among the Athenians, for example, 30 men who became tyrants from their own lust of gain not only involved their native land in great misfortunes but themselves soon lost their power and have bequeathed a deathless memorial of their own disgrace. The Lacedaemonians, after winning for themselves the undisputed sovereignty of Greece, were shorn of it from the moment when they sought to carry out unjust projects at the expense of their allies. For the superiority of those who enjoy leadership is maintained by goodwill and justice, and is overthrown by acts of injustice and by the hatred of their subjects. Similarly, Dionysius, the tyrant of the Syracusans, although he has been the most fortunate of such rulers, was incessantly plotted against while alive, was compelled by fear to wear an iron corselet under his tunic, and has bequeathed since his death his own life as an outstanding example unto all ages for the maledictions of men. But we shall record each one of these illustrations with more detail in connection with the appropriate period of time. For the present we shall take up the continuation of our account, pausing only to define our dates. In the preceding books we have set down a record of events from the capture of Troy to the end of the Peloponnesian War and of the Athenian Empire, covering a period of 779 years. In this book, as we add to our narrative the events next succeeding, we shall commence with the establishment of the 30 tyrants and stop with the capture of Rome by the Gauls, embracing a period of 18 years. There was no archon in Athens because of the overthrow of the government, it being the 780th year from the capture of Troy, and in Rome 4 military tribunes succeeded to the consular magistracy, Gaius Fulvius, Gaius Servilius, Gaius Valerius, and Numerius Fabius, and in this year the 94th Olympiad was celebrated, that in which Corcinus of Larissa was victor. At this time the Athenians, completely reduced by exhaustion, made a treaty with the Lacedaemonians whereby they were bound to demolish the walls of their city and to employ the polity of their fathers. They demolished the walls, but were unable to agree among themselves regarding the form of government. For those who were bent on oligarchy asserted that the ancient constitution should be revived, in which only a very few represented the state, whereas the greatest number, who were partisans of democracy, made the government of their fathers their platform and declared that this was by common consent a democracy. After a controversy over this had continued for some days, the oligarchic party sent an embassy to Lysander the Spartan, who, at the end of the war, had been dispatched to administer the governments of the cities and had established oligarchies in the greater number of them, for they hoped that, as well he might, he would support them in their design. Accordingly, they sailed across to Samos, for it happened that Lysander was tarrying there, having just seized the city. He gave his assent to their pleas for cooperation, appointed Thorax the Spartan harmost of Samos, and put in himself at the Piraeus with 100 ships. Calling an assembly of the Athenians, he advised them to choose 30 men to head the government and to manage all the affairs of the state. And when Theramenes opposed him and read to him the terms of the peace, which agreed that they should enjoy the government of their fathers, and declared that it would be a terrible thing if they should be robbed of their freedom contrary to the oaths, Lysander stated that the terms of peace had been broken by the Athenians, since, he asserted, they had destroyed the walls later than the days of grace agreed upon. He also invoked the direst of threats against Theramenes, saying that he would have him put to death if he did not stop opposing the Lacedaemonians. Consequently, Theramenes and the people, being struck with terror, were compelled to dissolve the democracy by a show of hands. Accordingly, 30 men were elected with power to manage the affairs of the state, as directors ostensibly, but tyrants in fact. The people, observing the fair dealing of Theramenes and believing that his honorable principles would act to some extent to check the encroachments of the leaders, elected him also as one of the 30 officials. It was the duty of those selected to appoint both the council and the other magistrates and to draw up laws in accordance with which they were to administer the state. Now they kept postponing the drawing up of laws, always putting forth fine-sounding excuses, but a council and the other magistrates they appointed from their personal friends, so that these men bore the name indeed of magistrates, but actually were underlings of the 30. At first they brought to trial the lowest elements of the city and condemned them to death, and thus far the most honorable citizens approved of their actions. But after this, desiring to commit acts more violent and lawless, they asked the Lacedaemonians for a garrison, saying that they were going to establish a form of government that would serve the interests of the Lacedaemonians. For they realized that they would be unable to accomplish murders without foreign armed aid, since all men, they knew, would unite to support the common security. When the Lacedaemonians sent a garrison and Calybius to command it, the 30 won the commander over by bribes and other accommodations. Then, choosing out from the rich such men as suited their ends, they proceeded to arrest them as revolutionaries, put them to death, and confiscated their possessions. When Theramenes opposed his colleagues and threatened to join the ranks of those who claimed the right to be secure, the 30 called a meeting of the council. Critias was their spokesman, and in a long speech accused Theramenes of betraying this government of which he was a voluntary member, but Theramenes in his reply cleared himself of the several charges and gained the sympathy of the entire council. Critias, fearing that Theramenes might overthrow the oligarchy, threw about him a band of soldiers with drawn swords. They were going to arrest him, but, forestalling them, Theramenes leaped up to the altar of Hestia of the council chamber, crying out, "I flee for refuge to the gods, not with the thought that I shall be saved, but to make sure that my slayers will involve themselves in an act of impiety against the gods." When the attendants came forward and were dragging him off, Theramenes bore his bad fortune with a noble spirit, since indeed he had had no little acquaintance with philosophy in company with Socrates. The multitude, however, in general mourned the ill fortune of Theramenes, but had not the courage to come to his aid since a strong armed guard stood around him. Now Socrates the philosopher and 2 of his intimates ran forward and endeavored to hinder the attendants. But Theramenes entreated them to do nothing of the kind. He appreciated, he said, their friendship and bravery, but as for himself, it would be the greatest grief if he should be the cause of the death of those who were so intimately associated with him. Socrates and his helpers, since they had no aid from anyone else and saw the intransigence of those in authority increasing, made no move. Then those who had received their orders dragged Theramenes from the altar and hustled him through the center of the marketplace to his execution, and the populace, terror-stricken at the arms of the garrison, were filled with pity for the unfortunate man and shed tears, not only over his fate, but also over their own slavery. For all the common sort, when they saw a man of such virtue as Theramenes treated with such contumely, had concluded that they in their weakness would be sacrificed without a thought. After the death of Theramenes, the 30 drew up a list of the wealthy, lodged false charges against them, put them to death, and seized their estates. They slew even Niceratus, the son of Nicias, who had commanded the campaign against the Syracusans, a man who had conducted himself toward all men with fairness and humanity, and who perhaps first of all Athenians in wealth and reputation. It came about, therefore, that every house was filled with pity for the end of the man, as fond thoughts, due to their memory of his honest ways, provoked them to tears. Nevertheless, the tyrants did not cease from their lawless conduct, rather their madness became so much the more acute that of the medics they slaughtered 60 of the wealthiest in order to gain possession of their property, and as for the citizens, since they were being killed daily, the well-to-do among them fled from the city almost to a man. They also slew Autolycus, an outspoken man, and, in a word, selected the most respectable citizens. So far did their wasting of the city go that more than half of the Athenians took to flight. The Lacedaemonians, seeing the city of the Athenians abased in power and having no desire that the Athenians should ever gain strength, were delighted and made their attitude clear, for they voted that the Athenian exiles should be delivered up to the 30 from all over Greece, and that anyone who attempted to prevent this should be liable to fine of 5 talents. Though this decree was shocking, all the rest of the cities, dismayed at the power of the Spartans, obeyed it, with the exception of the Argives, who, hating as they did the cruelty of the Lacedaemonians and pitying the hard lot of the unfortunate, were the first to receive the exiles in a spirit of humanity. Also the Thebans voted that anyone who witnessed an exile being led off and did not render him all aid within his power should be subject to a fine. Such, then, was the state of the affairs of the Athenians. In Sicily, Dionysius, the tyrant of the Siculi, after concluding peace with the Carthaginians, planned to busy himself more with the strengthening of his tyranny, for he assumed that the Syracusans, now that they were relieved of the war, would have plenty of time to see after the recovery of their liberty. And, perceiving that the island was the strongest section of the city and could be easily defended, he divided it from the rest of the city by an expensive wall, and in this he set high towers at close intervals, while before it he built places of business and stowers capable of accommodating a multitude of the populace. He also constructed on the island at great expense a fortified acropolis as a place of refuge in case of immediate need, and within its wall he enclosed the dockyards which are connected with the small harbour that is known as Laxium. The dockyards could accommodate 60 triremes and had an entrance that was closed off, through which only one ship could enter at a time. As for the territory of Syracuse, he picked out the best of it and distributed it in gifts to his friends as well as to higher officers, and divided the rest of it in equal portions both to aliens and to citizens, including under the name of citizens the manumitted slaves whom he designated as new citizens. He also distributed the dwellings among the common people, except those on the island, which he gave to his friends and the mercenaries. When Dionysius thought that he had now organized his tyranny properly, he led forth his army against the Siculi, being eager to bring all the independent peoples under his control, and the Siculi in particular, because of their previous alliance with the Carthaginians. Accordingly, he advanced against the city of the Herbicini and made preparations for its siege. But the Syracusans who were in the army, now that they had arms in their hands, began to gather in groups and upbraid each other that they had not joined with the cavalry in overthrowing the tyrant. The man appointed by Dionysius to command the men at first warned one of those who were free-spoken, and when the man retorted, stepped boldly up to him to give him a blow. The soldiers, in anger at this, slew the commander, whose name was Doricus, and, crying to the citizens to strike for their freedom, sent for the cavalry for men, for the cavalry, who had been banished at the beginning of the tyranny, occupied this outpost. Dionysius, terror-stricken at the revolt of the Syracusans, broke off the siege and hastened to Syracuse, being eager to secure the city. Upon his flight, those who had revolted chose as generals the men who had slain the commander, and gathering to their number the cavalry for men, they pitched a camp facing the tyrant on the height called Epipoli, and blocked his passage to the countryside. And they at once dispatched ambassadors to the Messenians and the regions, urging these people to join in the bid for freedom by action at sea, for it had been the practice of these cities at this time to man no less than 80 triremes. These triremes the cities dispatched at that time to the Syracusans, being eager to support them in the cause of freedom. The revolters also proclaimed a large reward to any who would slay the tyrant and promised citizenship to any mercenaries who would come over to them. They also constructed engines of war with which to shatter and destroy the walls, launched daily assaults upon the island, and kindly received any of the mercenaries who came over to them. Dionysius, being shut off as he now was from access to the countryside and constantly being abandoned by the mercenaries, gathered together his friends to counsel with them on the situation, for he had so completely despaired of maintaining his tyrannical power that he no longer was studying how to defeat the Syracusans, but rather how to meet death in such a way as to end his rule not altogether ingloriously. Now Halorus, one of his friends, or as some say, his adopted father, declared to him, "Tyranny is a fair winding sheet," but Polyxenus, his brother-in-law, advised him to use his swiftest horse and ride off into the domain of the Carthaginians to the Campanians, whom Himilcon had left behind to guard the districts of Sicily. Philistus, however, who composed his history after these events, declared in opposition to Polyxenus that it was not fitting to dash from the tyranny on a galloping horse, but to be cast out, dragged by the leg. Dionysius agreed with Philistus and decided to submit to anything rather than abandon the throne of his free will. Consequently, he sent ambassadors to those in revolt and urged them to allow him and his companions to leave the city, while he secretly dispatched messengers to the Campanians and promised them any price they should ask for the duration of the siege. After the events we have described, the Syracusans, having given the tyrant permission to sail away with 5 ships, took matters with rather less concern. The cavalry, since they were of no use in the siege, they discharged, while as for the infantry, most of them roved off into the countryside, assuming that the tyranny was already at an end. The Campanians, being elated at the promises they had received, first of all came to Agirium, and leaving their baggage there with Agirus, the ruler of the city, they set forth unencumbered for Syracuse, being in number 1,200 cavalry. Completing the journey in quick time, they came upon the Syracusans unexpectedly and, slaying many of them, they forced their way through to Dionysius. At this same time 300 mercenaries had also landed to aid the tyrant, so that his hopes revived. The Syracusans, as the despotic power again gathered strength, were at odds among themselves, some maintaining that they should remain and continue the siege and others that they should disband their forces and abandon the city. As soon as Dionysius learned of this, he led his army out against them, and falling on them while they were disordered, he easily routed them near the new city, as it is called. Not many of them, however, were slain, since Dionysius, riding among his men, stopped them from killing the fugitives. The Syracusans were forthwith scattered over the countryside, but a little later more than 7,000 of them were gathered with the cavalry at Eton. Dionysius, after burying the Syracusans who had fallen, dispatched ambassadors to Eton, asking the exiles to accept terms and return to their native land, and giving his pledged word that he would not bear enmity against them. Now certain of them, who had left behind children and wives, felt compelled to accept the offer, but the rest replied, when the ambassadors cited the benefaction Dionysius had performed in the burial of the dead, that he deserved the same favor, and they prayed to the gods that they might, the sooner the better, see him obtain it. These men accordingly, who would by no means put any trust in the tyrant, remained in Eton, watching for an opportunity against him. Dionysius treated with humanity the exiles who returned, wishing to encourage the rest to return to their native land too. To the Campanians he awarded the gifts that were due, and then dispatched them from the city, having regard to their fickleness. These made their way to Entella and persuaded the men of the city to receive them as fellow inhabitants. Then they fell upon them by night, slew the men of military age, married the wives of the men with whom they had broken faith, and possessed themselves of the city. In Greece the Lacedaemonians, now that they had brought the Peloponnesian War to an end, held the supremacy by common acknowledgement both on land and on sea. Appointing Lysander admiral, they ordered him to visit the cities and set up in each the magistrates they call harmos, for the Lacedaemonians, who had a dislike for the democracies, wished the cities to have oligarchic governments. They also levied tribute upon the peoples they had conquered, and although before this time they had not used coined money, they now collected yearly from the tribute more than 1,000 talents. When the Lacedaemonians had settled the affairs of Greece to their own taste, they dispatched Aristus, one of their distinguished men, to Syracuse, ostensibly pretending that they would overthrow the government, but in truth with intent to increase the power of the tyranny, for they hoped that by helping to establish the rule of Dionysius they would obtain his ready service, because of their benefactions to him. Aristus, after having put ashore at Syracuse and discussed secretly with the tyrant the matters we have mentioned, kept stirring up the Syracusans and promised to restore their liberty. Then he slew Nicotelles the Corinthian, a leader of the Syracusans, made strong the tyrant by betraying those who put their faith in him, and by such conduct brought disgrace both upon himself and upon his native land. Dionysius, sending the Syracusans out to harvest their crops, entered their homes and carried off the arms of them all. After this he built a second wall about the Acropolis, constructed war vessels, and also collected a great number of mercenaries, and he made every other provision to safeguard the tyranny, since he had learned by experience that the Syracusans would endure anything to escape slavery. While these events were taking place, Pharnabazus, the satrap of King Darius, seized Alcibiades the Athenian and put him to death. But since Ephorus recounts that his death was sought for other reasons, I think it not unprofitable to set forth the plot against Alcibiades as the historian has described it. He states in the 17th book that Cyrus and the Lacedaemonians were making secret plans for a joint war against Cyrus' brother Artaxerxes, and Alcibiades, learning of Cyrus' purpose from certain parties, went to Pharnabazus and told him of it in detail, and he asked him for someone to conduct him on a mission to Artaxerxes, since he wished to be the first to disclose the plot to the king. But Pharnabazus, on hearing the story, usurped the function of reporter and sent trusted men to disclose the matter to the king. When Pharnabazus did not provide escorts to the capital, Ephors continues, Alcibiades set out to the satrap of Paphlagonia in order to make the trip with his assistants, but Pharnabazus, fearing lest the king should hear the truth of the affair, sent men after Alcibiades to slay him on the road. These came upon him where he had taken shelter in a village of Phrygia, and in the night enclosed the place with a mass of fuel. When a strong fire was kindled, Alcibiades endeavored to save himself, but came to his death from the fire and the javelins of his attackers. About the same time, Democritus the philosopher died at the age of 90. And Lasthenes the Theban, who was the victor in the Olympic Games of this year, won a race, we are told, against a race horse, the course being from Caronia to the city of the Thebans. In Italy, the Roman garrison of Aruca, a city of the Volsci, was attacked by the enemy, who captured the city and slew most of the defenders. When the events of this year had come to an end, Euclides was archon in Athens, and in Rome 4 military tribunes succeeded to the consular magistracy: Publius Cornelius, Numerius Fabius, and Lucius Valerius. After these magistrates had taken office, the Byzantines were in serious difficulties both because of factional strife and of a war that they were waging with the neighboring Thracians, and since they were unable to devise a settlement of their mutual differences, they asked the Lacedaemonians for a general. The Spartans, accordingly, sent them Clearchus to bring order to the affairs of the city, and he, after being entrusted with supreme authority, and having gathered a large body of mercenaries, was no longer their president but their tyrant. First of all, he invited their chief magistrates to attend a festival of some kind and put them to death, and after this, since there was no government in the city, he seized a group of 30 prominent Byzantines, put a cord about their necks, and strangled them to death. After appropriating for himself the property of those he had slain, he also picked up the wealthy among the rest of the citizens, and launching false charges against them, he put some to death and drove others into exile. Having thus acquired a large amount of money and assembled a great body of mercenaries, he made his tyrannical power secure. When the cruelty and power of the tyrant became noised abroad, the Lacedaemonians first of all dispatched ambassadors to him to prevail upon him to lay down his tyrannical power, but when he paid no heed to their requests, they sent an army against him under the command of Panthoidas. Clearchus, on learning of his approach, transferred his army to Selymbria, being master also of this city, for he assumed that after the many crimes he had committed against the Byzantines, he would have as enemies not only the Lacedaemonians, but also the inhabitants of the city. Consequently, having decided that Selymbria would be a safer base for the war, he removed both his treasure and his army to that place. When he learned that the Lacedaemonians were close at hand, he advanced to meet them and joined battle with the troops of Panthoidas at the place called Porus. The struggle lasted a long while, but the Lacedaemonians fought splendidly and the forces of the tyrant were destroyed. Clearchus with a few of his companions was at first shut up in Selymbria and besieged there, but later he was fearful and slipped away by night, and crossed over to Ionia, where he became intimate with Cyrus, the brother of the Persian king, and won command of his troops. For Cyrus, who had been appointed supreme commander of the satrapies lying on the sea and was afire with ambition, was planning to lead an army against his brother Artaxerxes. Observing, therefore, that Clearchus possessed daring and a prompt boldness, he supplied him with funds and instructed him to enroll as many mercenaries as he could, believing that he would have in Clearchus an apt partner for his bold undertakings. Lysander the Spartan, after he had introduced governments in all the cities under the Lacedaemonians in accordance with the will of the Ephors, establishing a rule of 10 men in some and oligarchies in others, was the cynosure of Sparta. For by bringing the Peloponnesian War to an end, he had bestowed upon his native land the supreme power, acknowledged by all, both on land and on sea. Consequently, he conceived the idea of putting an end to the kingship of the Heraclidi and making every Spartan eligible to election as king, for he hoped that the kingship would very soon come to him because of his achievements, which were very great and glorious. Knowing that the Lacedaemonians gave very great heed to the responses of oracles, he attempted to bribe the prophetess in Delphi, since he believed that, if he should receive an oracular response favorable to the designs he entertained, he should easily carry his project to a successful end. But when he could not win over the attendants of the oracle, despite the large sum he promised them, he opened negotiations on the same matter with the priestesses of the oracle of Dodon, through a certain Pherocrates, who was a native of Apollonia and intimate with the attendants of the shrine. Meeting with no success, he made a journey to Cyrene, offering as his reason payment of vows to Ammon, but actually for the purpose of bribing the oracle, and he took with him a great sum of money with which he hoped to win over the attendants of the shrine. And in fact Libes, the king of those regions, was a guest friend of his father, and it so happened that Lysander's brother had been named Libes by reason of the friendship with the king. With the king's help, then, and the money he brought, he hoped to win them, but not only did he fail of his design, but the overseers of the oracle sent ambassadors to lay charges against Lysander for his effort to bribe the oracle. When Lysander arrived at Lacedaemon, a trial was proposed, but he presented a persuasive defense of his conduct. Now at that time, the Lacedaemonians knew nothing of Lysander's purpose to abolish the kings in line of descent from Heracles, but some time later, after his death, when some documents were being searched for in his house, they found a speech, composed at greatest expense, which he had prepared to deliver to the people, to persuade them that the kings should be elected from all the citizens. Dionysius, the tyrant of the Syracusans, after he had made peace with the Carthaginians and had got free of the uprisings in the city, was eager to attach to himself the neighboring cities of the Chalcidians, namely, Naxos, Catan, and Leontini. He was eager to be lord of them because they lay on the borders of Syracuse and possessed many advantages for further increase of his tyrannical power. First of all, then, he encamped near Eton and won the fortress, the exiles there being no match for an army of such size, and after this he advanced to Leontini and pitched his camp near the city along the river Tyria. Then he at first led out his army in battle order and dispatched a herald to the Leontines, commanding them to surrender the city and believing that he had struck terror into the inhabitants. But when the Leontines paid no attention to him and had made every preparation to withstand a siege, Dionysius, having no engines of war, gave up the siege for the time being, but plundered their entire territory. From there he set out against the Siculi, pretending that he was engaging in war against them in order that the Catanians and Naxians might become slacker in the defense of their cities. And while he was tarrying in the neighborhood of Enna, he persuaded Eumnestus, a native of the city, to make a bid for tyranny, promising to aid him in the undertaking. But when Eumnestus had succeeded in his design and then did not admit Dionysius into the city, Dionysius in anger changed sides and urged the Aeneans to overthrow the tyrant. These streamed into the marketplace with their arms, contending for their freedom, and the city was filled with tumult. Dionysius, on learning of the strife, took his light-armed troops, speedily broke through an unoccupied place into the city, seized Eumnestus, and handed him over to the Aeneans to be punished. He himself, refraining from all injustice, departed from the city. This he did, not so much because he had regard for right as because he wanted to encourage the other cities to put faith in him. From Enna Dionysius set out to the city of the Herbateans and attempted to ravage it. But accomplishing nothing, he made peace with them and led his army to Catan, for Arcesilaus, the general of the Catanians, had offered to betray the city to him. Consequently, being admitted by Arcesilaus about midnight, he became master of Catan. After taking their arms from the citizens, he placed an adequate garrison in the city. After this Proclus, the commander of the Naxians, on being won over by great promises, delivered over his native city to Dionysius, who, after paying the promised gifts to the traitor and granting him his kinsmen, sold the inhabitants into slavery, turned their property over to the soldiers to plunder, and razed the walls and the dwellings. He also meted out a similar treatment to the Catanians, selling the captives he took as booty in Syracuse. Now the territory of the Naxians he gave as a present to the neighboring Siculi and granted to the Campanians the city of the Catanians as their dwelling place. After this he advanced to Leontini with his entire armed strength and laid siege to the city, and sending ambassadors to the inhabitants, he ordered them to hand over their city and enjoy citizenship in Syracuse. The Leontines, expecting that they would receive no help and reflecting on the fate of the Naxians and Catanians, were struck with terror and fear that they would suffer the same misfortune. Consequently, yielding to the exigency of the moment, they assented to the proposal, left their city, and removed to Syracuse. Archonides, the leader of Herbite, after the citizen body of the Herbateans had concluded peace with Dionysius, determined to found a city. For he had not only many mercenaries, but also a mixed throng who had streamed into the city in connection with the war against Dionysius, and many of the destitute among the Herbateans had promised him to join in the colony. Consequently, taking the multitude of refugees, he occupied a hill lying 8 states from the sea, on which he founded the city of Haliasa, and since there were other cities of Sicily with the same name, he called it Haliasa Archonidion after himself. When, in later times, the city grew greatly both because of the trade by sea and because the Romans exempted it from tribute, the Halesians denied their kinship with the Herbateans, holding it a disgrace to be deemed colonists of an inferior city. Nevertheless, up to the present time numerous ties of relationships are to be found among both peoples, and they administered their sacrifices at the temple of Apollo with the same routine. But there are those who state that Haliasa was founded by the Carthaginians at the time when Himilcon concluded his peace with Dionysius. In Italy, a war arose between the Romans and the people of Veii for the following reasons. In this campaign, the Romans voted for the first time to give annual pay to the soldiers for their support. They also reduced by siege the city of the Volsci, which was called at that time Anxur, but now has the name Terracine. At the close of the year Mykion was archon in Athens, and in Rome 3 military tribunes took over the consular magistracy, Titus Quinctius, Gaius Julius, and Aulus Mammalus. After these magistrates had entered office, the inhabitants of Oropus fell into civil strife and exiled some of their citizens. For a time the exiles undertook to effect their return by their own resources, but finding themselves unable to carry through their purpose, they persuaded the Thebans to send an army to assist them. The Thebans took the field against the Oropians, and becoming masters of the city, resettled the inhabitants some 7 states from the sea, and for some time they allowed them to have their own government, but after this they gave them Theban citizenship and attached their territory to Boeotia. While these events were taking place, the Lacedaemonians brought a number of charges against the Aelians, the most serious being that they had prevented Agis, their king, from offering sacrifices to the god, and that they had not allowed the Lacedaemonians to compete in the Olympic Games. Consequently, having decided to wage war on the Aelians, they dispatched 10 ambassadors to them, ordering them, in the first place, to allow their subject cities to be independent, and after that they demanded of them their quota of the cost of the war against the Athenians. This they did in quest of specious pretexts for themselves and of plausible openings for war. When the Aelians not only paid no heed to them but even accused them besides of enslaving the Greeks, they dispatched Pausanias, the other of their 2 kings, against them with 4,000 soldiers. He was accompanied by many soldiers also from practically all the allies except the Boeotians and Corinthians. They, being offended by the proceedings of the Lacedaemonians, took no part in the campaign against Elis. Pausanias, then, entered Elis by way of Arcadia and straightway took the outpost of Lausion at the first assault. Then, leading his army through Acraria, he won to his side the 4 cities of Threstus, Halium, Epitalium, and Opus. Moving thence, he straightway encamped near Pylus and took this place, which was about 70 stades from Elis. After this, advancing to Elis proper, he pitched his camp on the hills across the river. A short time before this the Aelians had got from the Aetolians 1,000 elite troops to help them, to whom they had given the region about the Gymnasium to guard. When Pausanias first of all started to lay siege to this place, and in a careless manner, not supposing that the Aelians would ever dare to make a sortie against him, suddenly both the Aetolians and many of the citizens, pouring forth from the city, struck terror into the Lacedaemonians and slew some 30 of them. At the time Pausanias raised the siege, but after this, since he saw that the city would be hard to take, he traversed its territory, laying it waste and plundering it, even though it was sacred soil, and gathered great stores of booty. Since the winter was already at hand, he built walled outposts in Elis and left adequate forces in them, and himself passed the winter with the rest of the army in Dyme. In Sicily Dionysius, the tyrant of the Siculi, since his government was making satisfactory progress, determined to make war upon the Carthaginians, but being not yet sufficiently prepared, he concealed this purpose of his while making the necessary preparations for the coming encounters. And realizing that in the war with Athens the city had been blocked off by a wall that ran from the sea to the sea, he took care that he should never, when caught at a similar disadvantage, be cut off from contact with the countryside, for he saw that the site of Epipoli, as it is called, naturally commanded the city of the Syracusans. Sending, therefore, for his master builders, in accord with their advice he decided that he must fortify Epipoli at the point where there stands now the wall with the 6 gates. For this place, which faces north, is precipitous in its entirety, and so steep that access is hardly to be won from the outside. Wishing to complete the building of the walls rapidly, he gathered the peasants from the countryside, from whom he selected some 60,000 capable men and parceled out to them the space to be walled. For each stade he appointed a master builder, and for each plethron a mason, and the laborers from the common people assigned to the task numbered 200 for each plethron. Besides these, other workers, a multitude in number, quarried out the rough stone, and 6,000 yoke of oxen brought it to the appointed place. And the united labor of so many workers struck the watchers with great amazement, since all were zealous to complete the task assigned them. For Dionysius, in order to excite the enthusiasm of the multitude, offered valuable gifts to such as finished first, special ones for the master builders, and still others for the masons and in turn for the common laborers, and he in person, together with his friends, oversaw the work through all the days required, visiting every section and ever lending a hand to the toilers. Degree speaking generally, he laid aside the dignity of his office and reduced himself to the ranks. Putting his hands to the hardest tasks, he endured the same toil as the other workers, so that great rivalry was engendered, and some added even a part of the night to the day's labor. Such eagerness had infected the multitude for the task. As a result, contrary to expectation, the wall was brought to completion in 20 days. It was 30 stades in length and of corresponding height, and the added strength of the wall made it impregnable to assault, for there were lofty towers at frequent intervals, and it was constructed of stones 4 feet long and carefully joined. At the close of the year Exinidas was archon in Athens, and in Rome 6 military tribunes took over the consular magistracy: Publius Cornelius, Caeso Fabius, Spurius Nautius, Gaius Valerius, and Manius Sergius. At this time Osiris, who was commander of the satrapies on the sea, had been planning for a long while to lead an army against his brother Artaxerxes, for the young man was full of ambition and had a keenness for the encounters of war that was not unrewarded. When an adequate force of mercenaries had been collected for him and all preparations for the campaign had been completed, he did not reveal the truth to the troops, but kept asserting that he was leading the army to Cilicia against the despots who were in rebellion against the king. He also dispatched ambassadors to the Lacedaemonians to recall to their minds the services he had rendered in their war against the Athenians, and to urge them to join him as allies. The Lacedaemonians, thinking that the war would be to their advantage, decided to give aid to Cyrus and forthwith sent ambassadors to their admiral, named Samus, with instructions that he should carry out whatever Cyrus ordered. Samus had 25 triremes, and with these he sailed to Ephesus to Cyrus' admiral and was ready to cooperate with him in every respect. They also sent 800 infantry, giving the command to Chrysippus. The commander of the barbarian fleet was Thamos, who had 50 triremes which had been fitted out at great expense, and after the Lacedaemonians had arrived, the fleets put out to sea, following a course for Cilicia. Cyrus, after gathering to Sardis both the levies of Asia and 13,000 mercenaries, appointed Persians of his kindred to be governors of Lydia and Phrygia, but of Ionia, Aeolis, and the neighboring territories, his trusted friend Thamos, who was a native of Memphis. Then he with his army advanced in the direction of Cilicia and Pisidia, spreading the report that certain peoples of those regions were in revolt. From Asia he had in all 70,000 troops, of whom 3,000 were cavalry, and from the Peloponnesus and the rest of Greece 13,000 mercenaries. The soldiers from the Peloponnesus, with the exception of the Achaeans, were commanded by Clearchus the Lacedaemonian, those from Boeotia by Proxenus the Theban, the Achaeans by Socrates the Achaean, and those from Thessaly by Menon of Larissa. The officers of the barbarians, in minor commands, were Persians, and of the whole army Cyrus himself was commander-in-chief. He had disclosed to the commanders that he was marching against his brother, but he kept this hid from the troops for fear that they would leave his enterprise stranded because of the scale of his expedition. Consequently, along the march, by way of providing for the coming occasion, he curried favor with the troops by affability and by providing abundant supplies of provisions. After Cyrus had traversed Lydia and Phrygia as well as the regions bordering on Cappadocia, he arrived at the boundaries of Cilicia and the entrance at the Cilician gates. This pass is narrow and precipitous, 20 stades in length, and bordering it on both sides are exceedingly high and inaccessible mountains, and walls stretch down one side from the mountains as far as the roadway, where gates have been built across it. Leading his army through these gates, Cyrus entered a plain which in beauty yields to no plain in Asia, and through which he advanced to Tarsus, the largest city of Cilicia, which he speedily mastered. When Cyanisus, the lord of Cilicia, heard of the great size of the hostile army, he was at a great loss, since he was no match for it in battle. When he was summoned to Cyrus' presence and had been given pledges, he went to him, and on learning the truth about the war he agreed to join him as an ally against Artaxerxes, and he sent one of his 2 sons along with Cyrus, giving him also a strong contingent of Cilicians for his army. For Cyanisus, being by nature unscrupulous and having adjusted himself to the uncertainty of fortune, had dispatched his other son secretly to the king to reveal to him the armaments that had been gathered against him and to assure him that he took the part of Cyrus out of necessity, but that he was still faithful to the king and, when the opportunity arose, would desert Cyrus and join the army of the king. Cyrus rested his army 20 days in Tarsus, and after this, when he would have resumed the march, the troops suspected that the campaign was against Artaxerxes. And as each man reckoned up the length of the distances entailed and the multitude of hostile peoples through whom they would have to pass, he was filled with the deepest anxiety, for the word had got about that it was a 4 months' march for an army to Bactria, and that a force of more than 400,000 soldiers had been mustered for the king. Consequently, the soldiers became most fearful and vexed, and in anger at their commanders they attempted to kill them on the ground that the commanders had betrayed them. But when Cyrus entreated one and all of them and assured them that he was leading the army, not against Artaxerxes, but against a certain satrap of Syria, the soldiers yielded, and when they had received an increase in pay, they resumed their former loyalty to him. As Cyrus marched through Cilicia, he arrived at Issus, which lies on the sea and is the last city of Cilicia. At the same time, the fleet of the Lacedaemonians also put in at the city, and the commanders went ashore, met with Cyrus, and reported the goodwill of the Spartans toward him, and they disembarked and turned over to him the 800 infantry under the command of Chrysippus. The pretense was that these mercenaries were sent by the friends of Cyrus, but in fact everything was done with the consent of the ephors. The Lacedaemonians had not yet openly entered upon the war, but were concealing their purpose, awaiting the turn of the war. Cyrus set out with his army, traveling towards Syria, and ordered the admirals to accompany him by sea with all the ships. When he arrived at the gates, as they are called, and found the place clear of guards, he was elated, for he was greatly concerned lest troops might have occupied them before his arrival. The place is narrow and precipitous in character, so that it can be easily guarded by few troops. For 2 mountains lie against each other, the one jagged and with great crags, and the other beginning right at the road itself, and it is the largest in those regions, bearing the name Amanus and extending along Phoenicia, and the space between the mountains, some 3 stades in length, has walls running its whole length and gates close to make a narrow passage. Now, after passing through the gates without a fight, Cyrus sent off that part of the fleet that was still with him to make the return voyage to Ephesus, since it was of no further use to him now that he would be traveling inland. After a march of 20 days he arrived at the city of Thapsacus, which lies on the Euphrates River. Here he remained 5 days, and after winning the army to himself both by abundant supplies and by booty from foraging, he summoned it to an assembly and disclosed the truth about his campaign. When the soldiers received his words unfavorably, he besought them, one and all, not to leave him in the lurch, promising, besides other great rewards, that, when they came to Babylon, he would give every man of them 5 minas of silver. The soldiers, accordingly, soaring in their expectations, were prevailed upon to follow him. When Cyrus crossed the Euphrates with his army, he pressed on the way without making any halt, and as soon as he reached the borders of Babylonia he rested his troops. King Artaxerxes had learned some time before from Pharnabazus that Cyrus was secretly collecting an army to lead against him, and when he now learned that he was on the march, he summoned his armaments from every place to Ecbatana in Media. When the contingents from the Indians and certain other peoples were delayed because of the remoteness of those regions, he set out to meet Cyrus with the army that had been assembled. He had in all not less than 400,000 soldiers, including cavalry, as Ephors states. When he arrived on the plain of Babylonia, he pitched a camp beside the Euphrates, intending to leave his baggage in it, for he had learned that the enemy was not far distant and he was apprehensive of their reckless daring. Accordingly, he dug a trench 60 feet wide and 10 deep and encircled the camp with the baggage wagons of his train like a wall. Having left behind in the camp the baggage and the attendants who were of no use in the battle, he appointed an adequate guard for it, and leading forward in person his army unencumbered, he advanced to meet the enemy which was near at hand. When Cyrus saw the king's army advancing, he at once drew up his own force in battle order. The right wing, which rested on the Euphrates, was held by infantry composed of Lacedaemonians and some of the mercenaries, all under the command of Clearchus the Lacedaemonian, and helping him in the fight were the cavalry brought from Paphlagonia, more than 1,000. The left wing was held by the troops from Phrygia and Lydia and about 1,000 of the cavalry, under the command of Aridaeus. Cyrus himself had taken a station in the center of the battle line, together with the choicest troops gathered from the Persians and the other barbarians, about 10,000 strong, and leading the van before him were the finest equipped cavalry, 1,000, armed with Greek breastplates and swords. Artaxerxes stationed before the length of his battle line scythe-bearing chariots in no small number, and the wings he put under command of Persians, while he himself took his position in the center with no less than 50,000 elite troops. When the armies were about 3 stades apart, the Greeks struck up the paean and at first advanced at a slow pace, but as soon as they were within range of missiles they began to run at great speed. Clearchus the Lacedaemonian had given orders for them to do this, for by not running from a great distance he had in mind to keep the fighters fresh in body for the fray, while if they advanced on the run when at close quarters, this, it was thought, would cause the missiles shot by bows and other means to fly over their heads. When the troops with Cyrus approached the king's army, such a multitude of missiles was hurled upon them as one could expect to be discharged from a host of 400,000. Nevertheless, they fought but an altogether short time with javelin and then for the remainder of the battle closed hand to hand. The Lacedaemonians and the rest of the mercenaries at the very first contact struck terror into the opposing barbarians both by the splendor of their arms and by the skill they displayed. For the barbarians were protected by small shields and their divisions were for the most part equipped with light arms, and, furthermore, they were without trial in the perils of war, whereas the Greeks had been in constant battle by reason of the length of the Peloponnesian War and were far superior in experience. Consequently, they straightway put their opponents to flight, pushed after them in pursuit, and slew many of the barbarians. In the center of the lines, it so happened, were stationed both the men who were contending for the kingship. Consequently, becoming aware of this fact, they made at each other, being eagerly desirous of deciding the issue of the battle by their own hands, for fortune, it appears, brought the rivalry of the brothers over the throne to culmination in a duel as if in imitation of that ancient rash combat of Eteocles and Poloniuses so celebrated in tragedy. Cyrus was the first to hurl his javelin from a distance, and striking the king, brought him to the ground, but the king's attendants speedily snatched him away and carried him out of the battle. Tissaphernes, a Persian noble, now succeeded to the supreme command held by the king, and not only rallied the troops, but fought himself in splendid fashion, and retrieving the reverse involved in the wounding of the king and arriving on the scene everywhere his elite troops, he slew great numbers of the enemy, so that his presence was conspicuous from afar. Cyrus, being elated by the success of his forces, rushed boldly into the midst of the enemy and at first slew numbers of them as he set no bounds to his daring, but later, as he fought too imprudently, he was struck by a common Persian and fell mortally wounded. Upon his death, the king's soldiers gained confidence for the battle and in the end, by virtue of numbers and daring, wore down their opponents. On the other wing Aridaeus, who was second in command to Cyrus, at first withstood stoutly the charge of the barbarians, but later, since he was being encircled by the far extended line of the enemy and had learned of Cyrus' death, he turned in flight with the soldiers under his command to one of the stations where he had once stopped, which was not unsuited as a place for retreat. Clearchus, when he observed that both the center of his allies and the other part as well had been routed, stopped his pursuit, and calling back the soldiers, set them in order, for he feared that if the entire army should turn on the Greeks, they would be surrounded and slain to a man. The king's troops, after they had put their opponents to flight, first plundered Cyrus' baggage train and then, when night had come on, gathered in force and set upon the Greeks, but when the Greeks met the attack valiantly, the barbarians withstood them only a short while and after a little turned in flight, being overcome by their deeds of valor and skill. The troops of Clearchus, when they had slain great numbers of the barbarians, since it was already night, returned to the battlefield and set up a trophy, and about the second watch got safe to their camp. Such was the outcome of the battle, and of the army of the king more than 15,000 were slain, most of whom fell at the hands of the Lacedaemonians and mercenaries under the command of Clearchus. On the other side, some 3,000 of Cyrus' soldiers fell, while of the Greeks, we are told, not a man was slain, though a few were wounded. When the night was past, Aridaeus, who had fled to the stopping place, dispatched messengers to Clearchus, urging him to lead his soldiers to him and to join him in making a safe return to the regions on the sea. For now that Cyrus had been slain and the king's armaments held the advantage, deep concern had seized those who had dared to take the field to unseat Artaxerxes from the throne. Clearchus called together both the generals and commanders and took counsel with them on the situation. While they were discussing it, there came ambassadors from the king, the chief of whom was a man of Greece, Phalanus by name, who was a Zacynthian. They were introduced to the gathering and spoke as follows: King Artaxerxes says, "Since I have defeated and slain Cyrus, do you surrender your arms, come to my doors, and seek how you may appease me and gain some favor." To these words each general gave a reply much like that which Leonidas made when he was guarding the pass of Thermopylae, and Xerxes sent messengers ordering him to lay down his arms. For Leonidas at that time instructed the messengers to report to the king, "We believe that if we become friends of Xerxes, we shall be better allies if we keep our arms, and if we are forced to wage war against him, we shall fight the better if we keep them." When Clearchus had made a somewhat similar reply to the message, Proxenus the Theban said, "As things now stand, we have lost practically everything else, and all that is left to us is our valor and our arms. It is my opinion, therefore, that if we guard our arms, our valor also will be useful to us, but if we give them up, then not even our valor will be of any help to us." Consequently, he gave them this message to the king: "If you are plotting some evil against us, with our arms we will fight against you for your own possessions." We are told that also Sophilus, one of the commanders, said, "I am surprised at the words of the king, for if he believes that he is stronger than the Greeks, let him come with his army and take our arms away from us, but if he wishes to use persuasion, let him say what favor of equal worth he will grant us in exchange for them." After these speakers, Socrates the Achaean said, "The king is certainly acting toward us in a most astounding fashion, for what he wishes to take from us he requires at once, while what will be given us in return he commands us to request of him at a later time. In a word, if it is in ignorance of who are the victors that he orders us to obey his command as though we had been defeated, let him come with his numerous host and find out on whose side the victory lies, but if, knowing well enough that we are the victors, he uses lying words, how shall we trust his later promises?" After the messengers had received these replies, they departed, and Clearchus marched to the stopping place whither the troops had retired who had escaped from the battle. When the entire force had gathered in the same place, they counseled together how they should make their way back to the sea and what route they should take. Now it was agreed that they should not return by the same way they had come, since much of it was waste country where they could not expect provisions to be available with a hostile army on their heels. They resolved, therefore, to make toward Paphlagonia, and set out in that direction with the army, proceeding at a leisurely pace, since they gathered provisions as they marched. The king was recovering from his wound, and when he learned that his opponents were withdrawing, he believed that they were in flight and set out in haste after them with his army. As soon as he had overtaken them because of their slow progress, for the moment, since it was night, he went into camp near them, and when day came and the Greeks were drawing up their army for battle, he sent messengers to them and for the time being agreed upon a truce of 3 days. During this period they reached the following agreement: the king would see that his territory was friendly to them, he would provide them guides for their journey to the sea and would supply them with provisions on the way, the mercenaries under Clearchus and all the troops under Aridaeus would pass through his territory without doing any injury. After this they started on their journey, and the king led his army off to Babylon. In that city he accorded fitting honors to everyone who had performed deeds of courage in the battle, and Judge Tissaphernes seemed to have been the bravest of all. Consequently, he honored him with rich gifts, gave him his own daughter in marriage, and henceforth continued to hold him as his most trusted friend, and he also gave him the command which Cyrus had held over the satrapies on the sea. Tissaphernes, seeing that the king was angered at the Greeks, promised him that he would destroy them one and all, if the king would supply him with armaments and come to terms with Aridaeus, for he believed that Aridaeus would betray the Greeks to him in the course of the march. The king readily accepted this suggestion and allowed him to select from his entire army as many of the best troops as he chose. When Tissaphernes caught up with the Greeks, he sent word for Clearchus and the rest of the commanders to come to him and hear what he had to say in person. Consequently, practically all the generals, together with Clearchus and some 20 captains, went to Tissaphernes, and of the common soldiers about 200, who wanted to go to market, accompanied them. Tissaphernes invited the generals into his tent, and the captains waited at the entrance. And after a little, at the raising of a red flag from Tissaphernes' tent, he seized the generals within. Certain appointed troops fell upon the captains and slew them, and others killed the soldiers who had come to the market. Of the last, one made his escape to the camp and disclosed the disaster that had befallen them. When the soldiers learned what had taken place, at the moment they were panic-stricken and all rushed to arms in great disorder, since there was no one to command. But after this, since no one disturbed them, they elected a number of generals and put the supreme command in the hands of one, Chrysippus the Lacedaemonian. The generals organized the army for the march on the route they thought best and proceeded toward Paphlagonia. Tissaphernes sent the generals in chains to Artaxerxes, who executed the others, but spared Menon alone, since he alone, because of a quarrel with his allies, was thought to be ready to betray the Greeks. Tissaphernes, following with his army, clung to the Greeks, but he did not dare to meet them in battle face to face, fearing as he did the courage and recklessness of desperate men, and although he harassed them in places well suited for that purpose, he was unable to do them any great harm, but he followed them, causing slight difficulties, as far as the country of the people known as the Carduchi. Since Tissaphernes was unable to accomplish anything further, he set out with his army for Ionia, and the Greeks made their way for 7 days through the mountains of the Carduchi, suffering greatly at the hands of the natives, who were a warlike people and well acquainted with the region. They were enemies of the king and a free people who practiced the arts of war, and they especially trained themselves in hurling largest stones they could with slings, and in the use of enormous arrows, with which missiles they inflicted wounds on the Greeks from advantageous positions, slaying many and seriously injuring not a few. For the arrows were more than 2 cubits long and pierced both the shields and breastplates, so that no armor could withstand their force, and these arrows they used were so large, we are told, that the Greeks wound thongs about those that had been shot and used them as javelins to hurl back. Now after they had traversed with difficulty the country we have mentioned, they arrived at the river Centrites, which they crossed, and entered Armenia. The satrap here was Teribazus, with whom they made a truce and passed through his territory as friends. As they made their way through the mountains of Armenia, they encountered a heavy snow, and the entire army came near to perishing. What happened was this. At first, when the air was stirred, the snow began to fall in light quantities from the heavens, so that the marchers experienced no trouble in their advance, but after this a wind rose, and it came down heavier, and so covered the ground that not only the road but even any distinguishing landmarks could no longer be seen at all. Consequently, despondency and fear seized the army, which was unwilling to turn back to certain destruction and unable to advance because of the heavy snow. As the storm increased in intensity, there came a great wind and heavy hail which beat in gusts on their faces and forced the entire army to come to a halt, for everyone, being unable to endure the hardship entailed in a further advance, was forced to remain wherever he happened to be. Although without supplies of any kind, they stuck it out under the open sky that day and the following night, beset by many hardships, for because of the heavy snow which kept continually falling, all their arms were covered and their bodies were completely chilled by the frost in the air. The hardships they endured were so great that they got no sleep the entire night. Some lighted fires and got some help from them, and some, whose bodies were invaded by the frost, gave up all hope of succor, since practically all their fingers and toes were mortifying. Accordingly, when the night was past, it was found that most of the baggage animals had perished, and of the soldiers many were dead, and not a few, though still conscious, could not move their bodies because of the frost, and the eyes of some were blinded by reason of the cold and the glare from the snow. And every man would certainly have perished had they not gone on a little farther and found villages full of supplies. These villages had entrances for the beasts of burden which were tunneled under the ground, and others for the human inhabitants who descended into them by ladders. And in the houses the animals were supplied with hay, while the human inhabitants enjoyed a great abundance of all the necessities of life. After they had remained in the villages 8 days, they went on to the river Phasis. Here they passed 4 days, and then made their way through the territory of the Chaui and the Phasians. When the natives attacked them, they defeated them in battle, slaying great numbers of them, seized their farms, which abounded in provisions, and spent 15 days on them. Continuing their advance from here, they then traversed the territory of the Chaldeans, as they are called, in 7 days and arrived at the river named Harpagus, which was 4 plethra wide. From here their advance brought them through the territory of the Cetini by a road across a plain, on which they refreshed themselves for 3 days, enjoying all the necessities of life in plenty. After this they set out, and on the 4th day arrived at a large city which bore the name of Gymnasia. Here the ruler of these regions concluded a truce with them and furnished them guides to lead them to the sea. Arriving in 15 days at Mticinium, when the men marching in the van caught sight of the sea, they were overjoyed and raised such a cry that the men in the rear, assuming that there was an attack by enemies, rushed to arms. But when they had all got up to the place from which the sea could be seen, they raised their hands to the gods and gave thanks, believing they had now come through to safety, and gathering together into one spot a great number of stones, they formed from them great cairns on which they set up as a dedication spoils taken from the barbarians, wishing to leave an eternal memorial of their expedition. To the guide they gave as presents a silver bowl and a suit of Persian raiment, and he, after pointing out to them the road to the Macronians, took his departure. The Greeks then entered the territory of the Macronians, with whom they concluded a truce, receiving from them as a pledge of good faith a spear used by these barbarians and giving them in return a Greek one, for the barbarians declared that such an exchange had been handed down to them from their forefathers as the surest pledge of good faith. When they had crossed the boundaries of this people, they arrived at the territory of the Colchians. When the natives gathered here against them, the Greeks overcame them in battle and slew great numbers of them, and then, seizing a strong position on a hill, they pillaged the territory, gathered their booty on the hill, and refreshed themselves plentifully. There were found in the regions great numbers of beehives, which yielded valuable honey. But as many as partook of it succumbed to a strange affliction, for those who ate it lost consciousness, and falling on the ground were like dead men. Since many consumed the honey because of the pleasure its sweetness afforded, such a number had soon fallen to the ground as if they had suffered a rout in war. Now during that day the army was disheartened, terrified as it was at both the strange happening and the great number of the unfortunates, but on the next day at about the same hour all came to themselves, gradually recovered their senses, and rose up from the ground, and their physical state was like that of men recovered after a dose of a drug. When they had refreshed themselves for 3 days, they marched on to the Greek city of Trapezus, which is a colony of the Sinopians and lies in the territory of the Colchians. Here they spent 30 days, during which they were most magnificently entertained by the inhabitants, and they offered sacrifices to Heracles and to Zeus the Deliverer, and held a gymnastic contest at the place at which, men say, the Argo put in with Jason and his men. From here they dispatched Chrysippus their commander to Byzantium to get transports and triremes, since he claimed to be a friend of Anaxibius, the admiral of the Byzantines. The Greeks sent him off on a light boat, and then, receiving from the Trapezians 2 small boats equipped with oars, they plundered the neighboring barbarians both by land and by sea. Now for 30 days they waited for the return of Chrysippus, and when he still delayed and provisions for the troops were running low, they set out from Trapezus and arrived on the 3rd day at the Greek city of Cerasus, a colony of the Sinopians. Here they spent some days, and then came to the people of the Mosinetians. When the barbarians assembled against them, the Greeks defeated them in battle, slaying great numbers of them. And when they fled for refuge to a stronghold where they had their dwelling and which they defended with wooden towers 7 stories high, the Greeks launched successive assaults upon it and took it by storm. This stronghold was the capital of all the other walled communities, and in it, in the loftiest part, their king had his dwelling. A custom, handed down from their fathers, is followed that the king must remain for his entire life in the stronghold and from it issue his commands to the people. This was the most barbarous nation, the soldiers said, that they passed through. The men have intercourse with the women in the sight of all, the children of the wealthiest are nourished on boiled nuts, and they are all from their youth tattooed in various colors on both their back and breast. The territory they passed through in 8 days, and the next country, called Tiberine, in 3. From there they arrived at Katiora, a Greek city and a colony of the Sinopians. Here they spent 50 days, plundering both the neighboring peoples of Paphlagonia and the other barbarians. And the citizens of Heraclea and Sinope sent them vessels on which both the soldiers and their pack animals were conveyed across. Sinope was a colony founded by the Milesians, and situated as it was in Paphlagonia, it held first place among the cities of those regions, and it was in this city that in our day Mithridates, who went to war with the Romans, had his largest palace. And at that city also arrived Chrysippus, who had been dispatched, without success, to get triremes. Nevertheless, the Sinopians entertained them in kindly fashion and sent them on their way by sea to Heraclea, a colony of the Megarians, and the entire fleet came to anchor at the peninsula of Acherusia, where, we are told, Heracles led up Cerberus from Hades. As they proceeded from there on foot through Bithynia, they fell among perils, as the natives skirmished with them along their route. So they barely made their way to safety to Chrysopolis in Chalcedonia, 8,300 surviving of the original 10,000. From there some of the Greeks got back in safety, without further trouble, to their native lands, and the rest banded together around the Chersonesus and laid waste the adjoining territory of the Thracians. Such, then, was the outcome of the campaign of Cyrus against Artaxerxes, and Athens. The 30 tyrants, who were in supreme control, made no end out of daily exiling some citizens and putting to death others. When the Thebans were displeased at what was taking place and extended kindly hospitality to the exiles, Thrasybulus of the Demi of Styria, as he was called, who was an Athenian and had been exiled by the 30, with the secret aid of the Thebans seized a stronghold in Attica called Phyle. This was an outpost, which was not only very strong but was also only 100 stades distant from Athens, so that it afforded them many advantages for attack. The 30 tyrants, on learning of this act, at first led forth their troops against the band with the intention of laying siege to the stronghold. But while they were encamped near Phyle there came a heavy snow, and when some set to work to shift their encampment, the majority of the soldiers assumed that they were taking to flight and that a hostile force was at hand, and the uproar which men call panic struck the army and they removed their camp to another place. The 30, seeing that those citizens of Athens who enjoyed no political rights in the government of the 3,000 were elated at the prospect of the overthrow of their control of the state, transferred them to Piraeus and maintained their control of the city by means of mercenary troops, and accusing the Eleusinians and Salaminians of siding with the exiles, they put them all to death. While these things were being done, many of the exiles flocked to Thrasybulus, and the 30 dispatched ambassadors to Thrasybulus, publicly to treat with him about some prisoners, but privately to advise him to dissolve the band of exiles and to associate himself with the 30 in the rule of the city, taking the place of Theramenes. And they promised further that he could have license to restore to their native land any 10 exiles he chose. Thrasybulus replied that he preferred his own state of exile to the rule of the 30, and that he would not end the war unless all the citizens returned from exile and the people got back the form of government they had received from their fathers. The 30, seeing many revolting from them because of hatred and the exiles growing ever more numerous, dispatched ambassadors to Sparta for aid, and meanwhile themselves gathered as many troops as they could and pitched a camp in the open country near Acharni, as it is called. Thrasybulus, leaving behind an adequate guard at the stronghold, led forth the exiles, 1,200 in number, and delivering an unexpected attack by night on the camp of his opponents, he slew a large number of them, struck terror into the rest by his unexpected move, and forced them to flee to Athens. After the battle Thrasybulus set out straightway for the Piraeus and seized Munichia, which was an uninhabited and strong hill, and the tyrants with all the troops at their disposal went down to the Piraeus and attacked Munichia, under the command of Critias. In the sharp battle, which continued for a long time, the 30 held the advantage in numbers and the exiles in the strength of their position. At last, however, when Critias fell, the troops of the 30 were dismayed and fled for safety to more level ground, the exiles not daring to come down against them. When after this great numbers went over to the exiles, Thrasybulus made an unexpected attack upon his opponents, defeated them in battle, and became master of the Piraeus. At once many of the inhabitants of the city who wished to be rid of the tyranny flocked to the Piraeus, and all the exiles who were scattered throughout the cities of Greece, on hearing of the successes of Thrasybulus, came to the Piraeus, so that from now on the exiles were far superior in force. In consequence, they began to lay siege to the city. The remaining citizens in Athens now removed the 30 from office and sent them out of the city, and then they elected 10 men with supreme power first and foremost to put an end to the war, in any way possible, on friendly terms. But these men, as soon as they had succeeded to office, paid no attention to these orders, but established themselves as tyrants and sent to Lacedaemon for 40 warships and 1,000 soldiers, under the command of Lysander. But Pausanias, the king of the Lacedaemonians, being jealous of Lysander and observing that Sparta was in ill repute among the Greeks, marched forth with a strong army and on his arrival in Athens brought about a reconciliation between the men in the city and the exiles. As a result, the Athenians got back their country and henceforth conducted their government under laws of their own making, and the men who lived in fear of punishment for their unbroken series of past crimes they allowed to make their home in Eleusis. The Eleans, because they stood in fear of the superior strength of the Lacedaemonians, brought the war with them to an end, agreeing that they would surrender their triremes to the Lacedaemonians and let the neighboring cities go free. And the Lacedaemonians, now that they had brought their wars to an end and were no longer concerned with them, advanced with their army against the Messenians, of whom some were settled in an outpost on Cephallenia and others in Naupactus, which the Athenians had given them, among the western Locrians. Driving the Messenians from these regions, they returned the one outpost to the inhabitants of Cephallenia and the other to the Locrians. The Messenians, being now driven from every place because of their ancient hatred of the Spartans, departed with their arms from Greece, and some of them, sailing to Sicily, took service as mercenaries with Dionysius, while others, about 3,000 in number, sailed to Cyrene and joined the forces of exiles there. For at that time disorder had broken out among the Cyrenaeans, since Ariston, together with certain others, had seized the city. Of the Cyrenaeans, 500 of the most influential citizens had recently been put to death, and the most respected among the survivors had been banished. The exiles now added the Messenians to their number and joined battle with the men who had seized the city, and many of the Cyrenaeans were slain on both sides, but the Messenians were killed almost to a man. After the battle, the Cyrenaeans negotiated with each other and agreed to be reconciled, and they immediately swore oaths not to remember past injuries and live together as one body in the city. At this same time, the Romans increased the number of colonists in the city known as Velatri. At the close of this year, in Athens Laches was archon, and in Rome the consulship was administered by military tribunes Manius Claudius, Marcus Quinctius, Lucius Julius, Marcus Furius, and Lucius Valerius, and the 95th Olympiad was held, that in which Minos of Athens won the Stadion. This year Artaxerxes, the king of Asia, after his defeat of Cyrus, had dispatched Tissaphernes to take over all the satrapies which bordered on the sea. Consequently, the satraps and cities which had allied themselves with Cyrus were in great suspense, lest they should be punished for their offences against the king. Now all the other satraps, sending ambassadors to Tissaphernes, paid court to him and in every way possible arranged their affairs to suit him, but Thamos, the most powerful satrap, who commanded Ionia, put on triremes his possessions and all his sons except one whose name was Glauce and who became later commander of the king's armaments. Thamos then, in fear of Tissaphernes, sailed off with his fleet to Egypt and sought safety with Psammetichus, the king of the Egyptians, who was a descendant of the famous Psammetichus. Because of a good turn he had done the king in the past, Thamos believed that he would find in him a haven, as it were, from the perils he faced from the king of Persia. But Psammetichus, completely ignoring both the good turn and the hallowed obligation due to suppliants, put to the sword the man who was his suppliant and friend, together with his children, in order to take for his own both Thamos' possessions and his fleet. When the Greek cities of Asia learned that Tissaphernes was on his way, they were deeply concerned for their future and dispatched ambassadors to the Lacedaemonians, begging them not to allow the cities to be laid waste by the barbarians. The Lacedaemonians promised to come to their aid and sent ambassadors to Tissaphernes to warn him not to commit any acts of aggression against the Greek cities. Tissaphernes, however, advancing with his army against the city of the Samians first, both plundered its entire territory and got possession of many captives. After this he laid siege to the Samians, but on the approach of winter, since he was unable to capture the city, he released the captives for a heavy ransom and raised the siege. The Lacedaemonians appointed Thybron commander of the war against the king, gave him 1,000 soldiers from their own citizens, and ordered him to enlist as many troops from their allies as he should think desirable. Thybron, after going to Corinth and summoning soldiers from the allies to that city, set sail for Ephesus, with not more than 5,000 troops. Here he enrolled some 2,000 soldiers from his own and other cities, and then marched forth, with a total force of over 7,000. Advancing some 120 stades, he came to Magnesia, which was under the government of Tissaphernes. Taking the city at the first assault, he then advanced speedily to Tralles in Ionia and began to lay siege to the city, but when he was unable to achieve any success because of its strong position, he turned back to Magnesia. And since the city was unwalled and Thybron therefore feared that at his departure Tissaphernes would get control of it, he transferred it to a neighboring hill, which men call Thorax. Then Thybron, invading the territory of the enemy, glutted his soldiers with booty of every kind. But when Tissaphernes arrived with strong cavalry forces, he withdrew for security to Ephesus. At the same time, a group of the soldiers who had served in the campaign with Cyrus and had got back safe to Greece went off each to his own country, but the larger part of them, about 5,000 in number, since they had become accustomed to the life of a soldier, chose Xenophon for their general. And Xenophon with this army set out to make war on the Thracians who dwell around Salmydessus. The territory of this city, which lies on the left side of the Pontus, stretches for a great distance and is the cause of many shipwrecks. Accordingly, the Thracians made it their practice to lie in wait in those parts and seize the merchants who were cast ashore as prisoners. Xenophon with the troops he had gathered invaded their territory, defeated them in battle, and burned most of their villages. After this, when Thybron sent for the soldiers with the promise to hire them, they withdrew to join him and made war with the Lacedaemonians against the Persians. While these events were taking place, Dionysius founded in Sicily a city just below the crest of Mount Etna and named it Adranum, after a certain famous temple. In Macedonia, King Archelaus was unintentionally struck while hunting by Craterus, whom he loved, and met his end, after a reign of 7 years. He was succeeded on the throne by Orestes, who was still a boy and was slain by Arippus, his guardian, who held the throne for 6 years. In Athens, Socrates the philosopher, who was accused by Anytus and Meletus of impiety and of corrupting the youth, was condemned to death and met his end by drinking the hemlock. But since the accusation had been undeserved, the people repented, considering that so great a man had been put to death. Consequently, they were angered at the accusers and ultimately put them to death without trial. At the end of the year in Athens, aristocrates entered the office of archon, and in Rome the consular magistracy was taken over by 6 military tribunes: Gaius Servilius, Lucius Virginius, Quintus Sulpicius, Aulus Mutilius, and Manius Sergius. After these magistrates had entered office, the Lacedaemonians, learning that Thybron was conducting the war inefficiently, dispatched Dercyllidas as general to Asia, and he took over the army and advanced against the cities in the Troad. Now Hamaxitis and Colone and Arisba he took at the first assault, then Ilium and Serbenia and all the rest of the cities of the Troad, occupying some by craft and conquering the others by force. After this he concluded an armistice of 8 months with Pharnabazus and advanced against the Thracians who were dwelling at that time in Bithynia, and after laying waste their territory he led his army off into winter quarters. In Trachinian Heraclea civil discord had arisen, and the Lacedaemonians sent Eurypides there to restore order. As soon as Eurypides arrived in Heraclea he called an assembly of the people, and surrounding them with his hoplites, he arrested the authors of the discord and put them all to death, some 500 in number. And since the inhabitants about Ede had revolted, he made war on them, subjected them to many hardships, and forced them to leave their land. The majority of them, together with their children and wives, fled into Thessaly, from where they were restored to their homes 5 years later by the Boeotians. While these events were taking place, the Thracians invaded the Chersonesus in great multitudes, laid waste the whole region, and held its cities beleaguered. The inhabitants of the Chersonesus, being hard-pressed in the war, sent for the Lacedaemonian Dercyllidas to come from Asia. He, crossing over with his army, drove the Thracians out of the country and shut off the Chersonesus by a wall which he ran from sea to sea. By this act he prevented any future descent of the Thracians, and after being honored with great gifts he transported his army of the Asia. Pharnabazus, after the truce had been made with the Lacedaemonians, went back to the king and won him over to the plan of preparing a fleet and appointing Conon the Athenian as its admiral, for Conon was experienced in the encounters of war and especially in combat with the present enemy, and although he excelled in warfare, he was at the time in Cyprus at the court of Evagrius the king. After the king had been persuaded, Pharnabazus took 500 talents of silver and prepared to fit out a naval force. Sailing across to Cyprus, he ordered the kings there to make ready 100 triremes, and then, after discussions with Conon about the command of the fleet, he appointed him supreme commander at sea, giving indications in the name of the king of great hopes Conon might entertain. Conon, in the hope not only that he would recover the leadership in Greece for his native country if the Lacedaemonians were subdued in war, but also that he would himself win great renown, accepted the command. And before the entire fleet had been made ready, he took the 40 ships which were at hand and sailed across to Cilicia, where he began preparations for the war. Pharnabazus and Tissaphernes gathered soldiers from their own satrapies and marched out, making their way towards Ephesus, since the enemy had their forces in that city. The army accompanying them numbered 20,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. On hearing of the approach of the Persians, Dercyllidas, the commander of the Lacedaemonians, led out his army, having in all not more than 7,000 men. But when the forces drew near each other, they concluded a truce and set a period of time during which Pharnabazus should send word to the king regarding the terms of the treaty, should he be ready to end the war, and Dercyllidas should explain the matter to the Spartans. So upon this understanding the commanders dispersed their armies. The inhabitants of Rhegium, who were colonists of Chalcis, were angered to see the growing power of Dionysius. For he had sold into slavery the Naxians and Catanians, their kinsmen, and to the Rhegians, because they were of the same blood as these unfortunate peoples. This act was the cause of no ordinary concern, since all feared the same disaster would befall them. They therefore decided to take the field speedily against the tyrant, before he became entirely secure. Their decision upon war was forthwith supported strongly also by the Syracusans who had been exiled by Dionysius, for most of them were at that time resident in Rhegium and were continually discussing the matter and pointing out that all the Syracusans would seize the occasion to join in an attack. In the end, the Rhegians appointed generals and sent out with them 6,000 infantry, 600 cavalry, and 50 triremes. The generals crossed the strait and induced the generals of the Messenians to join in the war, declaring that it would be a terrible thing for them to stand idly by when Greek cities, and their neighbors, had been totally destroyed by the tyrant. Now the generals were won over by the Rhegians and, without obtaining a vote of the people, led forth their forces, which consisted of 4,000 infantry, 400 cavalry, and 30 triremes. But when the armaments we have mentioned had advanced as far as the borders of Messene, opposition broke out among the soldiers due to a harangue delivered by the Messenian Laomedon, for he advised them not begin a war against Dionysius, who had done them no wrong. Accordingly the Messenian troops, since the people had not approved the war, followed his advice at once, and, deserting their generals, turned back home, and the Rhegians, since they were not strong enough alone for a battle, when they saw that the Messenians were disbanding their army, also turned back speedily to Rhegium. At the outset Dionysius had led out his army to the border of the Syracusan territory, awaiting the attack of the enemy, but when he learned of their retirement, he led his forces back to Syracuse. When the Rhegians and Messenians sent ambassadors to treat upon terms of peace, he decided that it was to his advantage to put an end to enmity against these states and concluded peace. When Dionysius observed that some of the Greeks were deserting to the Carthaginian domain, taking with them their justice and their estates, he concluded that so long as he was at peace with the Carthaginians, many of his subjects would be wanting to join their defection, whereas, if there were war, all who had been enslaved by the Carthaginians would revolt to him. And he also heard that many Carthaginians in Libya had fallen victims to a plague which had raged among them. Thinking for these reasons, then, that he had a favorable occasion for war, he decided that preparation should first be effected, for he assumed that the war would be a great and protracted one since he was entering a struggle with the most powerful people of Europe. At once, therefore, he gathered skilled workmen, commandeering them from the cities under his control and attracting them by high wages from Italy and Greece as well as Carthaginian territory. For his purpose was to make weapons in great numbers and every kind of missile, and also quadriremes and quinquiremes, no ship of the latter size having yet been built at that time. After collecting many skilled workmen, he divided them into groups in accordance with their skills, and appointed over them the most conspicuous citizens, offering great bounties to any who created a supply of arms. As for the armor, he distributed among them models of each kind, because he had gathered his mercenaries from many nations, for he was eager to have every one of his soldiers armed with the weapons of his people, conceiving that by such armor his army would, for this very reason, cause great consternation, and that in battle all of his soldiers would fight to best effect in armor to which they were accustomed. And since the Syracusans enthusiastically supported the policy of Dionysius, it came to pass that rivalry rose high to manufacture the arms. For not only was every space, such as the porticos and back rooms of the temples as well as the gymnasia and colonnades of the marketplace, crowded with workers, but the making of great quantities of arms went on, apart from such public places, in the most distinguished homes. In fact, the catapult was invented at this time in Syracuse, since the ablest skilled workmen had been gathered from everywhere into one place. The high wages as well as the numerous prizes offered the workmen who were judged to be the best stimulated their zeal. And over and above these factors, Dionysius circulated daily among the workers, conversed with them in kindly fashion, and rewarded the most zealous with gifts and invited them to his table. Consequently, the workmen brought unsurpassable devotion to the devising of many missiles and engines of war that were strange and capable of rendering great service. He also began the construction of quadriremes and quinquiremes, being the first to think of the construction of such ships. For, hearing that triremes had first been built in Corinth, he was intent, in his city that had been settled by a colony from there, on increasing the scale of naval construction. After obtaining leave to transport timber from Italy, he dispatched half of his woodmen to Mount Etna, on which there were heavy stands at that time of both excellent fir and pine, while the other half he dispatched to Italy, where he got ready teams to convey the timber to the sea, as well as boats and crews to bring the workwood speedily to Syracuse. When Dionysius had collected an adequate supply of wood, he began at one and the same time to build more than 200 ships and to refit the 110 he already had, and he also constructed about the great harbor, as it is now called, 160 costly shipsheds, and repaired the 150 which were already there. With so many arms and ships under construction at one place, the beholder was filled with utter wonder at the sight. For whenever a man gazed at the eagerness shown in the building of the ships, he thought that every Greek in Sicily was engaged on their construction, and when, on the other hand, he visited the places where men were making arms and engines of war, he thought that all available labor was engaged on this alone. Moreover, despite the unsurpassable zeal devoted to the products we have mentioned, there were made 140,000 shields and a like number of daggers and helmets, and in addition corselets were made ready, of every design and wrought with utmost art, more than 14,000 in number. These Dionysius expected to distribute to his cavalry and the commanders of the infantry, as well as to the mercenaries who were to form his bodyguard. He also had catapults made of every style and a large number of the other missiles. For half of the ships of war which were prepared, the pilots, officers at the bow, and rowers were drawn from citizens, while for the rest of the vessels Dionysius hired mercenaries. When the building of the ships and the making of arms were completed, Dionysius turned his attention to the gathering of soldiers, for he believed it advantageous not to hire them far in advance in order to avoid heavy expenses. In this year Aristidemus, the writer of tragedies, produced his first play, and he lived 60 years. The Romans were besieging Veii, and when a sortie was made from the city, some of the Romans were cut to pieces by the Veientes, and others escaped by shameful flight. When this year had come to an end, Ithacles was archon in Athens, and in Rome 5 military tribunes were established in place of the consuls, Lucius Julius, Marcus Furius, Marcus Aemilius, Gaius Cornelius, and Caeso Fabius. Dionysius, the tyrant of the Syracusans, as soon as the major part of the task of making arms and building a fleet was completed, turned at once to the gathering of soldiers. From the Syracusans he enrolled those who were fit for military service in companies, and from the cities subject to him he summoned their able men. He also gathered mercenaries from Greece, and especially from the Lacedaemonians, for they, in order to aid him in building up his power, gave him permission to enlist as many mercenaries from them as he might wish. And, speaking generally, since he made a point of gathering his mercenary force from many nations and promised high pay, he found men who were responsive. Since Dionysius was going to raise up a great war, he addressed himself to the cities of Sicily with courtesy, eliciting their goodwill. He saw that the regions and Messenians who dwelt on the strait had a strong army mobilized, and he feared that, when the Carthaginians crossed over to Sicily, they would join the Carthaginians, for these cities would add no little weight to the side with which they allied themselves for the war. Since these considerations were the cause of great concern to Dionysius, he made a present to the Messenians of a large piece of territory on their borders, binding them to him by such a benefaction, and to the regions he dispatched ambassadors, urging them to form a connection by marriage and to give him in marriage a maiden who was a citizen of theirs, and he promised that he would win for them a large section of neighboring territory and do all that was in his power to add to the strength of their city. For since his wife, the daughter of Hermocrates, had been slain at the time the cavalry revolted, he was eager to beget children, in the belief that the loyalty of his offspring would be the strongest safeguard of his tyrannical power. Nevertheless, when an assembly of the people was held in Rhegium to consider Dionysius' proposal, after much discussion the regions voted not to accept the marriage connection. Now that Dionysius had failed of this design, he dispatched his ambassadors for the same purpose to the people of the Locrians. When they voted to approve the marriage connection, Dionysius sued for the hand of Doris, the daughter of Zenodus, who at that time was their most esteemed citizen. A few days before the marriage he sent to Locria Quinquereme, the first one he had built, embellished with silver and gold furnishings. On this he had the maiden conveyed to Syracuse, where he led her into the Acropolis. And he also sought in marriage from among the people of his city the most notable maiden among them, Aristomache, for whom he dispatched a chariot drawn by 4 white horses to bring her to his own home. After Dionysius had taken in marriage both maidens at the same time, he gave a series of public dinners for the soldiers and the larger part of the citizens, for he now renounced the oppressive aspect of his tyranny, and changing to a course of equitable dealing, he ruled over his subjects in more humane fashion, no more putting them to death or banishing them, as had been his practice. After his marriages, he let a few days pass and then called an assembly of the Syracusans and urged them to make war against the Carthaginians, declaring that they were most hostile to all Greeks generally and that they had designs at every opportunity on the Greeks of Sicily in particular. For the present, he pointed out, the Carthaginians were inactive because of the plague which had broken out among them and had destroyed the larger part of the inhabitants of Libya, but when they had recovered their strength, they would not refrain from attacking the Sicilian Greeks, against whom they had been plotting from the earliest time. It was therefore preferable, he continued, to wage a decisive war upon them while they were still weak than to wait and compete when they were strong. At the same time he pointed out how terrible a thing it was to allow the Greek cities to be enslaved by barbarians, and that these cities would the more zealously join in the war, the more eagerly they desired to obtain their freedom. After speaking at length in support of his policy, he speedily won the approval of the Syracusans. Indeed, they were no less eager than he for war, first of all because of their hatred of the Carthaginians who were the cause of their being compelled to take orders from the tyrant, secondly, because they hoped that Dionysius would treat them in more humane fashion because of his fear of the enemy and of an attack upon him by the citizens he had enslaved, but most of all, because they hoped that once they had got weapons in their hand, they could strike for their liberty, let fortune but give them the opportunity. After the meeting of the assembly, the Syracusans, with the permission of Dionysius, seized as plunder the property of the Phoenicians, for no small number of Carthaginians had their homes in Syracuse and rich possessions, and many also of their merchants had vessels in the harbor loaded with goods, all of which the Syracusans plundered. Similarly, the rest of the Sicilian Greeks drove out the Phoenicians who dwelt among them and plundered their possessions, for although they hated the tyranny of Dionysius, they were still glad to join in the war against the Carthaginians because of the cruelty of that people. For the very same reasons, too, the inhabitants of the Greek cities under the rule of the Carthaginians, as soon as Dionysius publicly enacted war, made open display of their hatred of the Phoenicians, for not only did they seize their property as plunder, but they also laid hands on their persons and subjected them to every kind of physical torture and outrage, remembering what they had themselves suffered during the time of their captivity. So far did they go in the vengeance they wreaked on the Phoenicians both at this time and subsequently, that the Carthaginians were taught the lesson no more to transgress the law in their treatment of conquered peoples, for they did not fail to realize, learning as they did by very deeds, that in war fortune is impartial to both combatants and in defeat both sides must suffer the same sort of thing that they themselves have done to those who were unfortunate. Now when Dionysius had made ready all his preparations for the war, he determined to send messengers to Carthage with the announcement, the Syracusans declare war upon the Carthaginians unless they restore freedom to the Greek cities that they have enslaved. Dionysius, then, was engaged in the affairs we have discussed. Ctesias the historian ended with this year his history of the Persians, which began with Ninus and Semiramis. And in this year, the most distinguished composers of dithyrambics were in their prime, Philoxenus of Cythera, Timotheus of Miletus, Telestus of Selinus, and Polyidus, who was also expert in the arts of painting and music. At the close of the year, in Athens Lysiades became archon, and in Rome 6 military tribunes administered the office of consul, Popilius Malleus, Publius Maelius, Spurius Furius, and Lucius Publius. When Dionysius, the tyrant of the Syracusans, had completed all his preparations for the war according to his personal design, he sent a herald to Carthage, having given him a letter to the Senate, which contained the statement that the Syracusans had resolved to make war upon the Carthaginians unless they withdrew from the Greek cities. The herald accordingly, pursuant to his orders, sailed to Libya and delivered the letter to the Senate. When it had been read in the council and subsequently before the people, it came about that the Carthaginians were not a little distressed at the thought of war, for the plague had killed great numbers of them, and they were also totally unprepared. Nevertheless, they waited for the Syracusans to take the initiative and dispatched members of the Senate with large sums of money to recruit mercenaries in Europe. Dionysius, with the Syracusans, the mercenaries, and his allies marched forth from Syracuse and made his way towards Eryx. For not far from this hill lay the city of Modi, a Carthaginian colony, which they used as their chief base of operations against Sicily, and Dionysius hoped that with this city in his power he would have no small advantage over his enemies. In the course of his march he received from time to time the contingents from the Greek cities, supplying the full levy of each with arms, for they were all eager to join his campaign, hating as they did the heavy hand of Phoenician domination and relishing the prospect at last of freedom. He received first the levy from Camarina, then those of Gela and Acragas, and after these he sent for the Himerians, whose home was on the other side of Sicily, and after adding the men of Selinus, as he passed by, he arrived at Modi with all his army. He had 80,000 infantry, well over 3,000 cavalry, and a little less than 200 warships, and he was accompanied by not less than 500 merchantmen loaded with great numbers of engines of war and all the other supplies needed. Since the armament was on the great scale we have described, the people of Eryx were awed by the magnitude of the force and, hating the Carthaginians as they did, came over to Dionysius. The inhabitants of Modi, however, expecting aid from the Carthaginians, were not dismayed at Dionysius' armament, but made ready to withstand a siege, for they were not unaware that the Syracusans would make Modi the first city to sack, because it was most loyal to the Carthaginians. This city was situated on an island lying 6 stades off Sicily, and was embellished artistically to the last degree with numerous fine houses, thanks to the prosperity of the inhabitants. It also had a narrow artificial causeway extending to the shore of Sicily, which the Mosens breached at this time, in order that the enemy should have no approach against them. Dionysius, after reconnoitering the area, together with his engineers, began to construct moles leading to Modi, hauled the warships up on land at the entrance of the harbor, and moored the merchantmen along the beach. After this, he left Leptins his admiral in command of the works, while he himself set out with the infantry of his army against the cities that were allies of the Carthaginians. Now the Sicani, fearing the great size of the army, all went over to the Syracusans, and of the rest of the cities only 5 remained loyal to the Carthaginians, these being Halicai, Solus, Egesta, Panormus, and Entella. Hence Dionysius plundered the territory of Solus and Panormus, and that also of Halicai, and cut down the trees on it, but he laid siege to Egesta and Entella with strong forces and launched continuous attacks upon them, seeking to get control of them by force. Such was the state of the affairs of Dionysius. Himilcon, the general of the Carthaginians, being himself busy with the mustering of the armaments and other preparations, dispatched his admiral with 10 triremes under orders to sail speedily in secret against the Syracusans, enter the harbor by night, and destroy the shipping left behind there. This he did, expecting to cause a diversion and force Dionysius to send part of his fleet back to the Syracusans. The admiral who had been dispatched carried out his orders with promptness and entered the harbor of the Syracusans by night while everyone was ignorant of what had taken place. Attacking unawares, he rammed the vessels lying at anchor along the shore, sank practically all of them, and then returned to Carthage. Dionysius, after ravaging all the territory held by the Carthaginians and forcing the enemy to take refuge behind walls, led all his army against Modi, for he hoped that when this city had been reduced by siege, all the others would forthwith surrender themselves to him. Accordingly, he at once put many times more men on the task of filling up the strait between the city and the coast, and, as the mole was extended, advanced his engines of war little by little toward the walls. Meanwhile Himilcon, the admiral of the Carthaginians, hearing that Dionysius had hauled his warships up on land, manned at once his 100 best triremes, for he assumed that if he appeared unexpectedly, he should easily seize the vessels, which were hauled up on land in the harbor, since he would be master of the sea. Once he succeeded in this, he believed, he would not only relieve the siege of Modi but also transfer the war to the city of the Syracusans. Sailing forth, therefore, with 100 ships, he arrived during the night at the territory of Selinus, skirted the promontory of Lilybaeum, and arrived at daybreak at Modi. Since his appearance took the enemy by surprise, he disabled some of the vessels anchored along the shore by ramming and others by burning, for Dionysius was unable to come to their defense. After this, he sailed into the harbor and drew up his ships as if to attack the vessels which the enemy had drawn up on land. Dionysius now massed his army at the entrance of the harbor, but when he saw that the enemy was lying in wait to attack as the ships left the harbor, he refused to risk launching his ships within the harbor, since he realized that the narrow entrance compelled a few ships to match themselves against an enemy many times more numerous. Consequently, using the multitude of his soldiers, he hauled his vessels over the land with no difficulty and launched them safely in the sea outside the harbor. Hamilcar attacked the first ships, but was held back by the multitude of missiles, for Dionysius had manned the ships with a great number of archers and slingers, and the Syracusans slew many of the enemy by using from the land the catapults which shot sharp-pointed missiles. Indeed, this weapon created great dismay, because it was a new invention at this time. As a result, Hamilcar was unable to achieve his design and sailed away to Libya, believing that a sea battle would serve no end, since the enemy's ships were double his in number. After Dionysius had completed the mole by employing a large force of laborers, he advanced war engines of every kind against the walls and kept hammering the towers with his battering rams, while with the catapults he kept down the fighters on the battlements, and he also advanced against the walls his wheeled towers, 6 stories high, which he had built to equal the height of the houses. The inhabitants of Modi, now that the threat was at hand grips, were nevertheless not dismayed by the armament of Dionysius, even though they had for the moment no allies to help them. Surpassing the besiegers in thirst for glory, they in the first place raised up men in crow's nests resting on yardarms suspended from the highest possible masts, and these from their lofty positions hurled lighted firebrands and burning tow with pitch on the enemy's siege engines. The flame quickly caught the wood, but the Sicilian Greeks, dashing to the scene, swiftly quenched it, and meantime the frequent blows of the battering rams broke down a section of the wall. Since now both sides rushed with one accord to the place, the battle that ensued grew furious. For the Sicilian Greeks, believing that the city was already in their hands, spared no effort in retaliating upon the Phoenicians for former injuries they had suffered at their hands, while the people of the city, envisioning the terrible fate of a life of captivity and seeing no possibility of flight either by land or by sea, faced death stoutly. And finding themselves shorn of the defense of the walls, they barricaded the narrow lanes and made the last houses provide a lavishly constructed wall. From this came even greater difficulties for the troops of Dionysius. For after they had burst through the wall and seemed to be already masters of the city, they were raked by missiles from men posted in superior positions. Nevertheless, they advanced the wooden towers to the first houses and provided them with gangways, and since the siege machines were equal in height to the dwellings, the rest of the struggle was fought hand to hand. For the Sicilian Greeks would launch the gangways and force a passage by them on to the houses. The Motians, as they took account of the magnitude of the peril, and with their wives and children before their eyes, fought the more fiercely out of fear for their fate. There were some whose parents stood by entreating them not to let them be surrendered to the lawless will of victors, who were thus wrought to a pitch where they set no value on life. Others, as they heard the laments of their wives and helpless children, sought to die like men rather than to see their children led into captivity. Flight of course from the city was impossible, since it was entirely surrounded by the sea, which was controlled by the enemy. Most appalling for the Phoenicians and the greatest cause of their despair was the thought how cruelly they had used their Greek captives and the prospect of their suffering the same treatment. Indeed, there was nothing left for them but, fighting bravely either to conquer or die. When such an obstinate mood filled the souls of the besieged, the Sicilian Greeks found themselves in a very difficult position. For, fighting as they were from the suspended wooden bridges, they suffered grievously both because of the narrow quarters and because of the desperate resistance of their opponents, who had abandoned hope of life. As a result, some perished in hand-to-hand encounter as they gave and received wounds, and others, pressed back by the motions and tumbling from the wooden bridges, fell to their death on the ground. In the end, while the kind of siege we have described had lasted some days, Dionysius made it his practice always toward evening to sound the trumpet for the recall of the fighters and break off the siege. When he had accustomed the Motians to such a practice, the combatants on both sides retiring, he dispatched Archelaus of Thurii with the elite troops, who, when night had fallen, placed ladders against the fallen houses, and mounting by them, seized an advantageous spot where he admitted Dionysius' troops. The Motians, when they perceived what had taken place, at once rushed to the rescue with all eagerness, and although they were too late, none the less faced the struggle. The battle grew fierce, and abundant reinforcements climbed the ladders, until at last the Sicilian Greeks wore down their opponents by weight of numbers. Straightway Dionysius' entire army burst into the city, coming also by the mole, and now every spot was a scene of mass slaughter, for the Sicilian Greeks, eager to return cruelty for cruelty, slew everyone they encountered, sparing without distinction not a child, not a woman, not an elder. Dionysius, wishing to sell the inhabitants into slavery for the money he could gather, at first attempted to restrain the soldiers from murdering the captives, but when no one paid any attention to him and he saw that the fury of the Sicilian Greeks was not to be controlled, he stationed heralds to cry aloud and tell the motions to take refuge in the temples, which were revered by the Greeks. When this was done, the soldiers ceased their slaughter and turned to looting the property, and the plunder yielded much silver and not a little gold, as well as costly raiment and an abundance of every other product of felicity. The city was given over by Dionysius to the soldiers to plunder, since he wished to whet their appetites for future encounters. After this success, he rewarded Archelaus, who had been the first to mount the wall, with 100 minas, and honored according to their merits all others who had performed deeds of valor. He also sold as booty the motions who survived, but he crucified Dameans and other Greeks who had fought on the side of the Carthaginians and had been taken captive. After this, Dionysius stationed guards in the city whom he put under the command of Biton of Syracuse, and the garrison was composed largely of sick Eli. He ordered Leptines his admiral with 120 ships to lie in wait for any attempt by the Carthaginians to cross to Sicily, and he also assigned to him the siege of Egesta and Entella, in accordance with his original plan to sack them. Then, since the summer was already coming to a close, he marched back to Syracuse with his army. In Athens, Sophocles, the son of Sophocles, began to produce tragedies and won the first prize 12 times. When the year had come to an end, in Athens Phormion assumed the archonship, and in Rome 6 military tribunes took the place of the consuls: Gnaeus Janutius, Lucius Attilius, Marcus Pomponius, Gaius Duilius, Marcus Veturius, and Valerius Publilius, and the 96th Olympiad was celebrated, that in which Eupoles of Elis was the victor. In the year when these magistrates entered office, Dionysius, the tyrant of the Syracusans, set out from Syracuse with his entire army and invaded the domain of the Carthaginians. While he was laying waste the countryside, the Halcyons, in dismay, sent an embassy to him and concluded an alliance. But the Egestaeans, falling unexpectedly by night on their besiegers and setting fire to the tents where they were camped, threw the men in the encampment into great confusion, for since the flames spread over a large area and the fire could not be brought under control, a few of the soldiers who came to the rescue lost their lives and most of the horses were burned, together with the tents. Now Dionysius ravaged the Carthaginian territory without meeting any opposition, and Leptines his admiral from his quarters in Modi kept watch against any approach of the enemy by sea. The Carthaginians, when they learned of the magnitude of the armament of Dionysius, resolved far to surpass him in their preparations. Consequently, lawfully according Himilcon's sovereign power, they gathered armaments from all Libya as well as from Iberia, summoning some from their allies and in other cases hiring mercenaries. In the end, they collected more than 300,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry in addition to chariots, which numbered 400 ships of war, and over 600 other vessels to convey food and engines of war and other supplies. These are the numbers stated by Ephorus. Timaeus, on the other hand, says that the troops transported from Libya did not exceed 100,000 and declares that an additional 30,000 were enlisted in Sicily. Himilcon gave sealed orders to all the pilots with commands to open them after they had sailed and to carry out the instructions. He devised the scheme in order that no spy should be able to report to Dionysius where they would put in, and the orders read for them to put in at Panormus. When a favorable wind arose, all the vessels cast off their cables and the transports put out to open sea, but the triremes sailed into the Libyan Sea and skirted the land. The wind continued favorable, and as soon as the leading vessels of the transports were visible from Sicily, Dionysius dispatched Leptines with 30 triremes under orders to ram and destroy all he could intercept. Leptines sailed forth promptly and straightway sank, together with their men, the first ships he encountered, but the rest, having all canvas spread and catching the wind with their sails, easily made their escape. Nevertheless, 50 ships were sunk, together with 5,000 soldiers and 200 chariots. After Himilcon had put in at Panormus and disembarked his army, he advanced toward the enemy, ordering the triremes to sail along beside him, and having himself taken Eryx by treachery as he passed, he took up quarters before Modi. Since Dionysius and his army were during this time at Egest, Himilcon reduced Modi by siege. Although the Sicilian Greeks were eager for a battle, Dionysius conceived it to be better, both because he was widely separated from his allied cities and because the transport of his food supplies was reduced, to renew the war in other areas. Having decided, therefore, to break camp, he proposed to the Sicani to abandon their cities for the present and to join him in the campaign, and in return he promised to give them richer territory of about equal size and, at the conclusion of the war, to return to their native cities any who so wished. Of the Sicani only a few, fearing that, if they refused, they would be plundered by the soldiers, agreed to Dionysius' offer. The Halcyons similarly deserted him and sent ambassadors to the Carthaginian camp and concluded an alliance with them. And Dionysius set out for Syracuse, laying waste the territory through which he led his army. Himilcon, now that his affairs were proceeding as he wished, made preparations to lead his army against Mycenae, being anxious to get control of the city because of its favorable facilities, for it had an excellent harbor, capable of accommodating all his ships, which numbered more than 600, and Himilcon also hoped that by getting possession of the straits he would be able to bar any aid from the Italian Greeks and hold in check the fleets that might come from the Peloponnesus. With this program in mind, he formed relations of friendship with the Himerians and the dwellers in the fort of Cephalledium, and seizing the city of Lipara, he exacted 30 talents from the inhabitants of the island. Then he set out in person with his entire army toward Mycenae, his ships sailing along the coast beside him. Completing the distance in a brief time, he pitched his camp at Pelorus, at a distance of 100 stades from Mycenae. When the inhabitants of this city learned that the enemy was at hand, they could not agree among themselves about the war. One party, when they heard reports of the great size of the enemy's army and observed that they themselves were without any allies, what is more, that their own cavalry were at Syracuse, were fully convinced that nothing could save them from capture. When contributed most to their despair was the fact that their walls had fallen down and that the situation allowed no time for their repair. Consequently, they removed from the city their children and wives and most valuable possessions to neighboring cities. Another party of the Messenians, however, hearing of a certain ancient oracle of theirs which ran, "Carthaginians must be bearers of water in Mycenae," interpreted the utterance to their advantage, believing that the Carthaginians would serve as slaves in Mycenae. Consequently, not only were they in a hopeful mood, but they made many others eager to face battle for their freedom. At once, then, they selected the ablest troops from among their young men and dispatched them to Pelorus to prevent the enemy from entering their territory. While the Messenians were busied in this way, Himilcon, seeing that they had sallied against his place of landing, dispatched 200 ships against the city, for he hoped, as well he might, that while the soldiers were trying to prevent his landing, the crews of the ships would easily seize Mycenae, stripped of defenders as it was. A north wind sprang up and the ships with all canvas spread entered the harbor, while the Messenians who were on guard at Pelorus, in spite of their hurried return, failed to arrive before the ships. Consequently, the Carthaginians invested Mycenae, forced their way through the fallen walls, and made themselves masters of the city. Of the Messenians, some were slain as they put up a gallant fight, others fled to the nearest cities, but the great mass of the common people took to flight through the surrounding mountains and scattered among the fortresses of the territory. Of the rest, some were captured by the enemy and some, who had been cut off in the area near the harbor, hurled themselves into the sea in hopes of swimming across the intervening strait. These numbered more than 200 and most of them were overcome by the current, only 50 making their way in safety to Italy. Himilcon now brought his entire army into the city and at first set to work to reduce the forts over the countryside, but since they were strongly situated and the men who had fled to them put up gallant struggles, he retired to the city, having found himself unable to master them. After this, he refreshed his army and made preparations to advance against Syracuse. The Siculi, who had hated Dionysius from of old and now had an opportunity to revolt, went over in a body, with the exception of the people of Isaurus, to the Carthaginians. In Syracuse, Dionysius set free the slaves and manned 60 ships from their numbers. He also summoned over 1,000 mercenaries from the Lacedaemonians, and went about the countryside strengthening the fortresses and storing them with provisions. He was most concerned, however, to fortify the citadels of the Leontines and to store in them the harvest from the plains. He also persuaded the Campanians who were dwelling in Catan to move to Eton, as it is now called, since it was an exceptionally strong fortress. After this, he led forth his entire army 160 stades from Syracuse and encamped near Taurus, as it is called. He had at that time 30,000 infantry, more than 3,000 cavalry, and 180 ships of war, of which only a few were triremes. Himilcon threw down the walls of Mycenae and issued orders to his soldiers to raze to the ground the dwellings, and to leave not a tile or timber or anything else, but either to burn or break them. When the many hands of the soldiers speedily accomplished this task, no one would have known that the site had been occupied. For, reflecting that the place was far separated from the cities which were his allies, and yet was the most strategically situated of any in Sicily, he had determined that he would see either that it was kept uninhabited or that it was an arduous and prolonged task to rebuild it. After Himilcon had exhibited his hatred for the Greeks by the calamity he visited upon the Messenians, he dispatched Magan his admiral with his naval armament under orders to sail to the peak known as Taurus. This area had been taken by Sicili in large numbers, who, however, had no leader. They had formerly been given by Dionysius the territory of the Naxians, but at this time, having been induced by Himilcon's offers, they occupied this peak. Since it was a strong position, both at this time and subsequent to the war, they made it their home, throwing a wall about it, and since those who gathered remained, Menian, upon Taurus, they named the city Tauromenium. Himilcon, advancing with his land forces, made so rapid a march that he arrived at the same time as Magan put in there by sea. But since there had recently been a fiery eruption from Mtn as far as the sea, it was no longer possible for the land forces to advance in the company of the ships as they sailed beside them, for the regions along the sea were laid waste by the lava, as it is called, so that the land army had to take its way around the peak of Etna. Consequently, he gave orders to Magan to come to port at Catan, while he himself advanced speedily through the heart of the country with the intention of joining the ships on the Catanian shore, for he was concerned lest, when his forces were divided, the Sicilian Greeks should fight a battle with Magan at sea. And this is what actually took place. For Dionysius, when he realized that Magan had a short sail, whereas the route of the land forces was toilsome and long, hastened to Catan with the object of attacking Magan by sea before the arrival of Himilcon. His hope was that his land forces lined up along the coast would embolden his own troops while the enemy would be the more fearful, and, what was the most important consideration, that if he should suffer a reverse of some kind, the ships in distress would be able to take refuge in the camp of the land forces. With this purpose in mind, he dispatched Leptines with his whole fleet under orders to engage with his ships in close order, and not to break his line lest he be endangered by the great numbers of his opponents, for, including merchantmen and oared vessels with brazen beaks, Magan had no less than 500 ships. When the Carthaginians saw the shore thronged with infantry and the ships of the Greeks bearing down on them, they were at once not a little alarmed and began to make for the land, but later, when they realized the risk they ran of destruction in giving battle at the same time both to the fleet and to the infantry, they quickly changed their mind. Deciding, therefore, to face the battle at sea, they drew up their ships and awaited the approach of the enemy. Leptines advanced with his 30 best vessels far ahead of the rest and joined battle, in no cowardly fashion, but without prudence. Attacking forthwith the leading ships of the Carthaginians, at the outset he sank no small number of the opposing triremes, but when Magan's massed ships crowded about the 30, the forces of Leptines surpassed in valor, but the Carthaginians in numbers. Consequently, as the battle grew fiercer, the steersmen laid their ships broadside in the fighting, and the struggle came to resemble conflicts on land. For they did not drive upon the opposing ships from a distance in order to ram them, but the vessels were locked together and the fighting was hand to hand. Some, as they leaped for the enemy's ships, fell into the sea, and others, who succeeded in their attempt, continued the struggle on the opponent's ships. In the end Leptines was driven off and compelled to flee to the open sea, and his remaining ships, attacking without order, were overcome by the Carthaginians, for the defeat suffered by the admiral raised the spirits of the Phoenicians and markedly discouraged the Sicilian Greeks. After the battle had ended in the manner we have described, the Carthaginians pursued with even greater ardor the enemy who were fleeing in disorder, and destroyed more than 100 of their ships, and stationing their lighter craft along the shore, they slew any of the sailors who were swimming toward the land army. And as they perished in great numbers not far from the land, while the troops of Dionysius were unable to help them in any way, the whole region was full of corpses and wreckage. There perished in the sea battle no small number of Carthaginians, but the loss of the Sicilian Greeks amounted to more than 100 ships and over 20,000 men. After the battle the Phoenicians anchored their triremes in the harbor of Catan, took in tow the ships they had captured, and when they had brought them in, repaired them, so that they made the greatness of their success not only a tale for the ears but also a sight for the eyes of the Carthaginians. The Sicilian Greeks made their way towards Syracuse, but as they reflected that they would certainly be invested and forced to endure a laborious siege, they urged Dionysius to seek an immediate encounter with Himilcon because of his past victory, for, they said, perhaps their unexpected appearance would strike terror into the barbarians, and they could repair their late reverse. Dionysius was at first won over by these advisors and ready to lead his army against Himilcon, but when some of his friends told him that he ran the risk of losing the city if Magan should set out with his entire fleet against Syracuse, he quickly changed his mind, and in fact he knew that Mycenae had fallen to the hands of the barbarians in a similar manner. And so, believing that it was not safe to strip the city of defenders, he set out for Syracuse. The majority of the Sicilian Greeks, being angered at his unwillingness to encounter the enemy, deserted Dionysius, some of them departing to their own countries and others to fortresses in the neighborhood. Himilcon, who had reached in 2 days the coast of the Catanians, hauled all the ships up on land, since a strong wind had arisen, and, while resting his forces for some days, sent ambassadors to the Campanians who held Aten, urging them to revolt from Dionysius. He promised both to give them a large amount of territory and to let them share in the spoils of the war. He also informed them that the Campanians dwelling in Entella found no fault with the Carthaginians and took their side against the Sicilian Greeks, and he pointed out that as a general thing the Greeks as a race are the enemies of all other peoples. But since the Campanians had given hostages to Dionysius and had sent their choicest troops to Syracuse, they were compelled to maintain the alliance with Dionysius, although they would gladly have joined the Carthaginians. After this, Dionysius, who was in terror of the Carthaginians, sent his brother-in-law Polixenus as ambassador both to the Greeks in Italy and to the Lacedaemonians, as well as the Corinthians, begging them to come to his aid and not to suffer the Greek cities of Sicily to be utterly destroyed. He also sent to the Peloponnesus men with ample funds to recruit mercenaries, ordering them to enlist as many soldiers as they could without regard to economy. Himilcon decked his ships with the spoils taken from the enemy and put in at the great harbor of the Syracusans, and he caused great dismay among the inhabitants of the city. For 250 ships of war entered the harbor, with oars flashing in order and richly decorated with the spoils of war. Then came the merchantmen, in excess of 3,000, laden with more than 500, and the whole fleet numbered some 200 vessels. The result was that the harbor of the Syracusans, despite its great size, was blocked up by the vessels, and it was almost entirely concealed from view by the sails. The sails had just come to anchor when at once from the other side the land army advanced, consisting, as some have reported, of 300,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry. The general of the armaments, Himilcon, took up his quarters in the temple of Zeus, and the rest of the multitude encamped in the neighborhood 12 stades from the city. After this, Himilcon led out the entire army and drew up his troops in battle order before the walls, challenging the Syracusans to battle, and he also sailed up to the harbors with 100 of his finest ships in order to strike terror into the inhabitants of the city and to force them to concede that they were inferior at sea as well. But when no one ventured to come out against him, for the time being he withdrew his troops to the camp and then for 30 days overran the countryside, cutting down the trees and laying it all waste, in order not only to satisfy the soldiers with every kind of plunder, but also to reduce the besieged to despair. Himilcon seized the suburb of Acradine, and he also plundered the temples of both Demeter and Kore, for which acts of impiety against the divinity he quickly suffered a fitting penalty. For his fortune quickly worsened from day to day, and whenever Dionysius made bold to skirmish with him, the Syracusans had the better of it. Also at night unaccountable tumults would arise in the camp and the soldiers would rush to arms, thinking that the enemy was attacking the palisade. To this was added a plague, which was the cause of every kind of suffering. But of this we shall speak a little later, in order that our account may not anticipate the proper time. Now when he threw a wall about the camp, Himilcon destroyed practically all the tombs in the area, among which was that of Gelon and his wife Demerite, of costly construction. He also built 3 forts along the sea, one at Plemmyrium, one at the middle of the harbor, and one by the temple of Zeus, and into them he brought wine and grain and all other provisions, believing that the siege would continue a long time. He also dispatched merchant ships to Sardinia and Libya to secure grain and every kind of food. Polixenus, the brother-in-law of Dionysius, arrived from the Peloponnesus and Italy, bringing 30 warships from his allies, with Pherecydes the Lacedaemonian as admiral. After this, Dionysius and Leptines had set out with warships to escort a supply of provisions, and the Syracusans, who were thus left to themselves, seeing by chance a vessel approaching laden with food, sailed out against it with 5 ships, seized it, and brought it to the city. The Carthaginians put out against them with 40 ships, whereupon the Syracusans manned all their ships, and in the ensuing battle both captured the flagship and destroyed 24 of the remainder, and then, pursuing the fleeing ships as far as the enemy's anchorage, they challenged the Carthaginians to battle. Elated at their success and thinking how often Dionysius had met defeat, whereas they, without his presence, had won a victory over the Carthaginians, they were now puffed up with pride. And as they gathered in groups, they talked together about how they took no steps to end their slavery to Dionysius, even though they had an opportunity to depose him, for up until then they had been without arms, but now because of the war they had weapons at their command. Even while discussions of this kind were taking place, Dionysius sailed into the harbor and, calling an assembly, praised the Syracusans and urged them to be of good courage, promising that he would speedily put an end to the war. And he was on the point of dismissing the assembly when Theodorus, a Syracusan, who was held in high esteem among the cavalry and was considered a man of action, made bold to speak as follows in regard to their liberty. Although Dionysius has introduced some falsehoods, the last statement he made was true, that he would speedily put an end to the war. He could accomplish this if he were no longer our commander, for he has often been defeated, but had returned to the citizens the freedom their fathers enjoyed. As things are, no one of us faces battle with good courage so long as victory differs not a whit from defeat, for if conquered, we shall have to obey the commands of the Carthaginians, and if conquerors, to have in Dionysius a harsher master than they would be. For even should the Carthaginians defeat us in war, they would only impose a fixed tribute and would not prevent us from governing the city in accordance with our ancient laws, but this man has plundered our temples, has taken the property of private citizens together with the lives of their owners, and pays a wage to servants to secure the enslavement of their masters. Such horrors as attend the storming of cities are perpetrated by him in time of peace, yet he promises to put an end to the war with the Carthaginians. But it behooves us, fellow citizens, to put an end not only to the Phoenician war but to the tyrant within our walls. For the Acropolis, which is guarded by the weapons of slaves, is a hostile redoubt in our city. The multitude of mercenaries has been gathered to hold the Syracusans in slavery, and he lords it over the city, not like a magistrate dispensing justice on equal terms, but like a dictator who by policy makes all decisions for his own advantage. For the time being the enemy possess a small portion of our territory, but Dionysius has devastated it all and given it to those who join in increasing his tyranny. How long, then, are we to be patient though we suffer such abuses as brave men endure to die rather than to experience them? In battle against the Carthaginians we bravely face the final sacrifice, but against a harsh tyrant, in behalf of freedom and our fatherland, even in speech we no longer dare to raise our voices. We face in battle so many myriads of the enemy, but we stand in shivering fear of a single ruler, who has not the manliness of a superior slave. Surely no one would think of comparing Dionysius with Gelon of old. For Gelon, by reason of his own high character, together with the Syracusans and the rest of the Sicilian Greeks, set free the whole of Sicily, whereas this man, who found the cities free, has delivered all the rest of them over to the lordship of the enemy and has himself enslaved his native state. Gelon fought so far forward in behalf of Sicily that he never let his allies in the cities even catch sight of the enemy, whereas this man, after fleeing from Modi through the entire length of the island, has cooped himself up within our walls, full of confidence against his fellow citizens, but unable to bear even the sight of the enemy. As a consequence Gelon, by reason both of his high character and of his great deeds, received the leadership by the free will not only of the Syracusans but also of the Sicilian Greeks, while, as for this man whose generalship has led to the destruction of his allies and the enslavement of his fellow citizens, how can he escape the just hatred of all? For not only is he unworthy of leadership but, if justice were done, would die 10,000 deaths. Because of him Gela and Camarina were subdued, Messene lies in total ruin, 20,000 allies are perished in a sea battle, and, in a word, we have been enclosed in one city and all the other Greek cities throughout Sicily have been destroyed. For in addition to his other male factions he sold into slavery Naxos and Catan, he has completely destroyed cities that were allies, cities whose existence was opportune. With the Carthaginians he has fought 2 battles, and has come out vanquished in each. Yet when he was entrusted with a generalship by the citizens but one time, he speedily robbed them of their freedom, slaying those who spoke openly on behalf of the laws, and exiling the more wealthy. He gave the wives of the banished in marriage to slaves, and to a motley throng, he put the weapons of citizens in the hands of barbarians and foreigners. And these deeds, O Zeus and all the gods, were the work of a public clerk, of a desperate man. Where, then, is the Syracusan's love of freedom? Where the deeds of our ancestors? I say nothing of the 300,000 Carthaginians who were totally destroyed at Himera. I pass by the overthrow of the tyrants who followed Gelon. But only yesterday, as it were, when the Athenians attacked Syracuse with such great armaments, our fathers left not a man free to carry back word of the disaster. And shall we, who have such great examples of our fathers' valor, take orders from Dionysius, especially when we have weapons in our hands? Surely some divine providence has gathered us here, with allies about us and weapons in our hands, for the purpose of recovering our freedom, and it is within our power this day to play the part of brave men and rid ourselves with one accord of our heavy yoke. For hitherto, while we were disarmed and without allies and guarded by a multitude of mercenaries, we have, I dare say, yielded to the pressure of circumstances, but now, since we have arms in our hands and allies to give us aid as well as bear witness of our bravery, let us not yield, but make it clear that it was circumstances, not cowardice, that made us submit to slavery. Are we not ashamed that we should have as commander in our wars the man who has plundered the temples of our city, and that we choose as representative in such important matters a person to whom no man of good sense would entrust the management of his private affairs? And though all other peoples in times of war, because of the great perils they face, observe with the greatest care their obligations to the gods, do we expect that a man of such notorious impiety will put an end to the war? In fact, if a man cares to put a finer point on it, he will find that Dionysius is as wary of peace as he is of war. For he believes that, as matters stand, the Syracusans, because of their fear of the enemy, will not attempt anything against him, but that once the Carthaginians have been defeated they will claim their freedom, since they will have weapons in their hands, and will be proudly conscious of their deeds. Indeed, this is the reason, in my opinion, why in the first war he betrayed Gela and Camarina and made these cities desolate, and why in his negotiations he agreed that most of the Greek cities should be given over to the enemy. After this he broke faith in time of peace with Naxos and Catan and sold the inhabitants into slavery, razing one to the ground and giving the other to the Campanians from Italy to dwell in. And when, after the destruction of these peoples, the rest of Sicily made many attempts to overthrow his tyranny, he again declared war upon the Carthaginians, for his scruple against breaking his agreement in violation of the oaths he had taken was not so great as his fear of the surviving concentrations of the Sicilian Greeks. Moreover, it is obvious that he has been at all times on the alert to effect their destruction. First of all at Panormus, when the enemy were disembarking and were in bad physical condition after the stormy passage, he could have offered battle, but did not choose to do. After that he stood idly by and sent no help to Messene, a city strategically situated and of great size, but allowed it to be razed, not only in order that the greatest possible number of Sicilian Greeks should perish, but also that the Carthaginians might intercept the reinforcements from Italy and the fleets from the Peloponnesus. Last of all, he joined battle offshore at Catan, careless of the advantage of pitching battle near the city, where the vanquished could find safety in their own harbors. After the battle, when strong winds sprang up and the Carthaginians were forced to haul their fleet up on land, he had a most favorable opportunity for victory, for the land forces of the enemy had not yet arrived, and the violent storm was driving the enemy's ships on the shore. At that time, if we had all attacked on land, the only outcomes left the enemy would have been either to be captured with ease, if they left their ships, or to strew the coast with wreckage, if they matched their strength against the waves. But to lodge accusations against Dionysius at greater length among Syracusans is, I should judge, not necessary. For if men who have suffered in very deeds such irretrievable ruin are not roused to rage, will they, forsooth, be moved by words to wreak vengeance upon him, men too who have seen his behavior as the worst of citizens, the harshest of tyrants, the most ignoble of all generals? For as often as we have stood in line of battle under his command, so often have we been defeated, whereas but just now, when we fought independently, we defeated with a few ships the enemy's entire force. We should, therefore, seek out another leader, to avoid fighting under a general who has pillaged the shrines of the gods, and so finding ourselves engaged in a war against the gods, for it is manifest that heaven opposes those who have selected the worst enemy of religion to be their commander. noting that when he is present our armies in full force suffer defeat, whereas, when he is absent, even a small detachment is sufficient to defeat the Carthaginians. Should not all men see in this the visible presence of the gods? Therefore, fellow citizens, if he is willing to lay down his office of his own accord, let us allow him to leave the city with his possessions, but if he does not choose to do so, we have at the present moment the fairest opportunity to assert our freedom. We are all gathered together, we have weapons in our hands, we have allies about us, not only the Greeks from Italy but also those from the Peloponnesus. The chief command must be given, according to the laws, either to citizens, or to the Corinthians who dwell in our mother city, or to the Spartans who are the first power in Greece. After this speech by Theodorus, the Syracusans were in high spirits and kept their eyes fixed on their allies, and when Pherecydes the Lacedaemonian, the admiral of the allies, stepped up to the platform, all expected that he would take the lead for liberty. But he was on friendly terms with the tyrant and declared that the Lacedaemonians had dispatched him to aid the Syracusans and Dionysius against the Carthaginians, not to overthrow the rule of Dionysius. At this statement so contrary to expectation the mercenaries flocked about Dionysius, and the Syracusans in dismay made no move, although they called down many curses on the Spartans. For on a previous occasion Aretes the Lacedaemonian, at the time that he was asserting the right of the Syracusans to freedom, had betrayed them, and now at this time Pherecydes vetoed the movement of the Syracusans. For the moment Dionysius was in great fear and dissolved the assembly, but later he won the favor of the multitude by kindly words, honoring some of them with gifts and inviting some to general banquets. After the Carthaginians had seized the suburb and pillaged the temple of Demeter and Kore, a plague struck the army. Over and above the disaster sent by influence of the city, there were contributing causes, that myriads of people were gathered together, that it was the time of year which is most productive of plagues, and that the particular summer had brought unusually hot water. It also seems likely that the place itself was responsible for the excessive extent of the disaster, for on a former occasion the Athenians too, who occupied the same camp, had perished in great numbers from the plague, since the terrain was marshy and in a hollow. First, before sunrise, because of the cold from the breeze over the waters, their bodies were struck with chills, but in the middle of the day the heat was stifling, as must be the case when so great a multitude is gathered together in a narrow place. Now the plague first attacked the Libyans, and, as many of them perished, at first they buried the dead, but later, both because of the multitude of corpses and because those who tended the sick were seized by the plague, no one dared approach the suffering. When even nursing was thus omitted, there was no remedy for the disaster. For by reason of the stench of the enberid and the miasma from the marshes, the plague began with a catarrh, then came a swelling in the throat, gradually burning sensations ensued, pains in the sinews of the back, and a heavy feeling in the limbs, then dysentery supervened and pustules upon the whole surface of the body. In most cases this was the course of the disease, but some became mad and totally lost their memory. They circulated through the camp, out of their mind, and struck at anyone they met. In general, as it turned out, even help by physicians was of no avail, both because of the severity of the disease and the swiftness of the death, for death came on the 5th day or on the 6th at the latest, amidst such terrible tortures that all looked upon those who had fallen in the war as blessed. In fact, all who watched beside the sick were struck by the plague, and thus the lot of the ill was miserable, since no one was willing to minister to the unfortunate. For not only did any not akin abandon one another, but even brothers were forced to desert brothers, friends to sacrifice friends out of fear for their own lives. When Dionysius heard of the disaster that had struck the Carthaginians, he manned 80 ships and ordered Pherecydes and Leptines the admirals to attack the enemy's ships at daybreak, while he himself, profiting by a moonless night, made a circuit with his army and, passing by the temple of Syene, arrived near the camp of the enemy at daybreak before they were aware of it. The cavalry and 1,000 infantry from the mercenaries were dispatched in advance against that part of the Carthaginian encampment which extended toward the interior. These mercenaries were the most hostile, beyond all others, to Dionysius and had engaged time and again in factional quarrels and uproars. Consequently, Dionysius had issued orders to the cavalry that as soon as they came to blows with the enemy they should flee and leave the mercenaries in the lurch. When this order had been carried out and the mercenaries had been slain to a man, Dionysius set about laying siege to both the camp and the forts. While the barbarians were still dismayed at the unexpected attack and bringing up reinforcements in disorderly fashion, he on his part took by storm the fort known as Palicna, and on the opposite side the cavalry, aided in an attack by some of the triremes, stormed the area around Duscon. At once all the warships joined in the attack, and when the army raised the war cry at the taking of the forts, the barbarians were in a state of panic. For at the outset they had rushed in a body against the land troops in order to ward off the assailants of the camp, but when they saw the fleet also coming up to attack, they turned back to give help to the naval station. The swift course of events, however, outstripped them, and their haste was without result. Even as they were mounting on the decks and manning the triremes, the enemy's vessels, driven on by rowers, struck the ships athwart in many cases. Now one well-delivered blow would sink a damaged ship, but blows and repeated rammings, which broke through the nailed timbers, struck terrible dismay into the opponents. Since all about the mightiest ships were being shattered, the rending of the vessels by the crushing blows raised a great noise, and the shore extending along the scene of the battle was strewn with corpses. The Syracusans, eagerly co-operating in their success, rivaled one another in great zeal to be the first to board the enemy's ships, and surrounding the barbarians, who were terror-stricken at the magnitude of the peril they faced, put them to death. Nor did the infantry who were attacking the naval station show less zeal than the others, and among them, it so happened, was Dionysius himself, who had ridden on horseback to the section about Doscon. Finding their 40 ships of 50 oars, which had been drawn up on the beach, and beside them merchant ships and some triremes at anchor, they set fire to them. Quickly the flame leaped up into the sky and, spreading over a large area, caught the shipping, and none of the merchants or owners was able to bring any help because of the violence of the blaze. Since a strong wind arose, the fires carried from the ships drawn up on land to the merchantmen lying at anchor. When the crews dived into the water from fear of suffocation and the anchor cables were burnt off, the ships came into collision because of the rough seas, some of them being destroyed as they struck one another, and others as the wind drove them about, but the majority of them were victims of the fire. Thereupon, as the flames swept up through the sails of the merchant ships and consumed the yardarms, the sight was like a scene from the theatre to the inhabitants of the city, and the destruction of the barbarians resembled that of men struck by lightning from heaven for their impiety. Forthwith, elated by the Syracusan successes, both the oldest youths and such aged men as were not yet entirely incapacitated by years manned lighters, and approaching, without order altogether made for the ships in the harbour. Those which the fire had ruined they plundered, stripping them of anything that could be saved, and such as were undamaged they took in tow and brought to the city. Thus even those who by age were exempt from war duties were unable to restrain themselves, but in their excessive joy their ardent spirit prevailed over their age. When the news of the victory ran through the city, children and women, together with their households, left their homes, everyone hurrying to the walls, and the whole extent was crowded with spectators. Of these some raised their hands to heaven and returned thanks to the gods, and others declared that the barbarians had suffered the punishment of heaven for their plundering of the temples. For from a distance the sight resembled a battle with the gods, such a number of ships going up in fire, the flames leaping aloft among the sails, the Greeks applauding every success with great shouting, and the barbarians in their consternation at the disaster keeping up a great uproar and confused crying. But as night came the battle ceased for the time, and Dionysius kept to the field against the barbarians, pitching a camp near the temple of Zeus. Now that the Carthaginians had suffered defeat on land as well as on sea, they entered into negotiations with Dionysius, without the knowledge of the Syracusans. They asked him to allow their remaining troops to cross back to Libya, and promised to give him the 300 talents which they had there in their camp. Dionysius replied that he would not be able to allow the whole army to escape, but he consented to their citizen troops alone withdrawing secretly at night by sea, for he knew that the Syracusans and their allies would not allow him to make any such terms with the enemy. Dionysius acted as he did to avoid the total destruction of the Carthaginian army, in order that the Syracusans, by reason of their fear of the Carthaginians, should never find a time of ease to assert their freedom. Accordingly, Dionysius agreed that the flight of the Carthaginians should take place by night on the 4th day hence, and led his army back into the city. Himilcon during the night conveyed the 300 talents to the Acropolis and delivered them to the persons stationed on the island by the tyrant, and then himself, when the time agreed upon had arrived, manned 40 triremes during the night with the citizens of Carthage and began his flight, abandoning all the rest of his army. He had already made his way across the harbour, when some of the Corinthians observed his flight and speedily reported it to Dionysius. Since Dionysius took his time in calling the soldiers to arms and gathering the commanders, the Corinthians did not wait for him but speedily put out to sea against the Carthaginians, and vying with each other in their rowing they caught up with the last Phoenician ships, which they shattered with their rams and sent to the bottom. After this, Dionysius led out the army, but the Siculi, who were serving in the army of the Carthaginians, forestalling the Syracusans, fled through the interior and, almost to a man, made their way in safety to their native homes. Dionysius stationed guards at intervals along the roads and then led his army against the enemy's camp while it was still night. The barbarians, abandoned as they were by their general, by the Carthaginians, and by the Siculi as well, were dispirited and fled in dismay. Some were taken captive as they fell in with the guards on the roads, but the majority threw down their arms, surrendered themselves, and asked only that their lives be spared. Some Iberians alone massed together with their arms and dispatched a herald to treat about taking service with him. Dionysius made peace with the Iberians and enrolled them in his mercenaries, but the rest of the multitude he made captive, and whatever remained of the baggage he turned over to the soldiers to plunder. With such swiftness did fortune work a change in the affairs of the Carthaginians, and point out to all mankind that those who become elated above due measure quickly give proof of their own weakness. For they who had in their hands practically all the cities of Sicily with the exception of Syracuse and expected its capture, of a sudden were forced to be anxious for their own fatherland. They who overthrew the tombs of the Syracusans gazed upon 150,000 dead lying in heaps and unburied because of the plague. They who wasted with fire the territory of the Syracusans now in their turn saw their own fleet of a sudden go up in flames. They who so arrogantly sailed with their whole armada into the harbor and flaunted their successes before the Syracusans had little thought that they were to steal away by night and leave their allies at the mercy of their enemy. The general himself, who had taken the temple of Zeus for his headquarters and the pillaged wealth of the sanctuaries for his own possession, slipped away in disgrace to Carthage with a few survivors, in order that he might not by dying and paying a debt to nature go unscathed for his acts of impiety, but should in his native land lead a life that was notorious, while reproaches were heaped on him on every hand. Indeed, so calamitous was his lot that he went about the temples of the city in the cheapest clothing, charging himself with impiety and offering acknowledged retribution to heaven for his sins against the gods. In the end, he passed sentence of death upon himself and starved himself to death. And he bequeathed to his fellow citizens a deep respect for religion, for straightway fortune heaped upon them the other calamities of war as well. When the news of the Carthaginian disaster had spread throughout Libya, their allies, who had long hated the oppressive rule of the Carthaginians and even more at this time because of the betrayal of the soldiers at Syracuse, were inflamed against them. Consequently, being led on partly by anger and partly by contempt for them because of the disaster they had suffered, they endeavored to assert their independence. After exchanging messages with one another, they collected an army, moved forward, and pitched camp in the open. Since they were speedily joined not only by freemen but also by slaves, there was gathered in a short time a body of 200,000 men. Seizing Tynes, a city situated not far from Carthage, they based their line of battle on it, and since they had the better of the fighting, they confined the Phoenicians within their walls. The Carthaginians, against whom the gods were clearly fighting, at first gathered in small groups and in great confusion and besought the deity to put an end to its wrath. Thereupon the entire city was seized by superstitious fear and dread, as every man anticipated in imagination the enslavement of the city. Consequently, they voted by every means to propitiate the gods who had been sinned against. Since they had included neither Kor nor Demeter in their rites, they appointed their most renowned citizens to be priests of these goddesses, and consecrating statues of them with all solemnity, they conducted their rites, following the ritual used by the Greeks. They also chose out the most prominent Greeks who lived among them and assigned them to the service of the goddesses. After this, they constructed ships and made careful provision of supplies for the war. Meanwhile, the revolters, who were a motley mass, possessed no capable commanders, and what was of first importance, they were short of provisions because they were so numerous, while the Carthaginians brought supplies by sea from Sardinia. Furthermore, they quarreled among themselves over the supreme command, and some of them were bought off with Carthaginian money and deserted the common cause. As a result, both because of the lack of provisions and because of treachery on the part of some, they broke up and scattered to their native lands, thus relieving the Carthaginians of the greatest fear. Such was the state of affairs in Libya at this time. Dionysius, seeing that the mercenaries were most hostile to him and fearing that they might depose him, first of all arrested Aristotle, their commander. At this, when the body of them ran together under arms and demanded their pay with some sharpness, Dionysius declared that he was sending Aristotle to Lacedaemon to face trial among his fellow citizens, and offered to the mercenaries, who numbered about 10,000, in lieu of their pay the city and territory of the Leontines. To this they gladly agreed because the territory was good land, and after portioning it out in allotments they made their home in Leontini. Dionysius then recruited other mercenaries and trusted in them and his freedmen to maintain the government. After the disaster which the Carthaginians had suffered, the survivors from the cities of Sicily that had been enslaved gathered together, gained back their native lands, and revived their strength. Dionysius settled in Messene 1,000 Locrians, 4,000 Midmians, and 600 Messenians from the Peloponnesus who were exiles from Zacynthus and Naupactus. But when he observed that the Lacedaemonians were offended that the Messenians whom they had driven out were settled in a renowned city, he removed them from Messene, and giving them a place on the sea, he cut off some area of Abyssine and annexed it to their territory. The Messenians named their city Tyndaris, and by living in concord together and admitting many to citizenship, they speedily came to number more than 5,000 citizens. After this, Dionysius waged a number of campaigns against the territory of the Siculi, in the course of which he took Menaenum and Morgantinum and struck a treaty with Agirus, the tyrant of the Agirinians, and Damon, the lord of the Centauropans, as well as with the Herbateans and the Assurini. He also gained by treachery Cephalledium, Solus, and Enna, and made peace besides with the Herbacini. Such was the state of affairs in Sicily at this time. In Greece, the Lacedaemonians, foreseeing how great their war with the Persians would be, put one of the two kings, Agesilaus, in command. After he had levied 6,000 soldiers and constituted a council of 30 of his foremost fellow citizens, he transported the armament from Aulis to Ephesus. Here he enlisted 4,000 soldiers and took the field with his army, which numbered 10,000 infantry and 400 cavalry. They were also accompanied by a throng of no less number which provided a market and was intent upon plunder. He traversed the plain of Caister and laid waste the territory held by the Persians until he arrived at Syme. From this as his base he spent the larger part of the summer ravaging Phrygia and neighboring territory, and after sating his army with pillage he returned toward the beginning of autumn to Ephesus. While these events were taking place, the Lacedaemonians dispatched ambassadors to Nepharius, the king of Egypt, to conclude an alliance. He, in place of the aid requested, made the Spartans a gift of equipment for 100 triremes and 500,000 measures of grain. Pharax, the Lacedaemonian admiral, sailing from Rhodes with 120 ships, put in at Sasanda in Curia, a fortress 150 stades from Caunus. From this as his base he laid siege to Caunus and blockaded Conon, who was commander of the king's fleet and lay at Caunus with 40 ships. But when Artaphernes and Pharnabazus came with strong forces to the aid of the Caunians, Pharax lifted the siege and sailed off to Rhodes with the entire fleet. After this Conon gathered 80 triremes and sailed to the Chersonesus, and the Rhodians, having expelled the Peloponnesian fleet, revolted from the Lacedaemonians and received Conon, together with his entire fleet, into their city. Now the Lacedaemonians, who were bringing the gift of grain from Egypt, being unaware of the defection of the Rhodians, approached the island in full confidence, but the Rhodians and Conon, the Persian admiral, brought the ships in the harbors and stored the city with grain. There also came to Conon 90 triremes, 10 of them from Cilicia and 80 from Phoenicia, under the command of the lord of the Sidonians. After this Agesilaus led forth his army into the plain of Caister and the country around Sipylus and ravaged the possessions of the inhabitants. Tissaphernes, gathering 10,000 cavalry and 50,000 infantry, followed close on the Lacedaemonians and cut down any who became separate from the main body while plundering. Agesilaus formed his soldiers in a square and clung to the foothills of empty Sipylus, awaiting a favorable opportunity to attack the enemy. He overran the countryside as far as Sardis and ravaged the orchards and the pleasure park belonging to Tissaphernes, which had been artistically laid out at great expense with plants and all other things that contribute to luxury and the enjoyment in peace of the good things of life. He then turned back, and when he was midway between Sardis and Thibarne, he dispatched by night the Spartan Xenocles with 1,400 soldiers to a thickly wooded place to set an ambush for the barbarians. Then Agesilaus himself moved at daybreak along the way with his army. And when he had passed the place of ambush and the barbarians were advancing upon him without battle order and harassing his rear guard, to their surprise he suddenly turned about on the Persians. When a sharp battle followed, he raised the signal to the soldiers in ambush, and they, chanting the battle song, charged the enemy. The Persians, seeing that they were caught between the forces, were struck with dismay and turned at once in flight. Pursuing them for some distance, Agesilaus slew over 6,000 of them, gathered a great multitude of prisoners, and pillaged their camp, which was stored with goods of many sorts. Tissaphernes, thunderstruck at the daring of the Lacedaemonians, withdrew from the battle to Sardis, and Agesilaus was about to attack the satrapies farther inland, but led his army back to the sea when he could not obtain favorable omens from the sacrifices. When Artaxerxes, the king of Asia, learned of the defeats, being alarmed by the war with the Greeks, he was angry at Tissaphernes, since he considered him to be responsible for the war. He had also been asked by his mother, Parysatis, to grant her revenge upon Tissaphernes, for she hated him for denouncing her son Cyrus, when he made his attack upon his brother. Accordingly, Artaxerxes appointed Tithras commander with orders to arrest Tissaphernes and sent letters to the cities and the satraps that all should perform whatever he commanded. Tithras, on arriving at Colossae in Phrygia, with the aid of Arius, a satrap, arrested Tissaphernes while he was in the bath, cut off his head, and sent it to the king. Then he persuaded Agesilaus to enter into negotiations and concluded with him a truce of 6 months. While affairs in Asia were handled as we have described, the Phocians went to war with the Boeotians because of certain grievances and persuaded the Lacedaemonians to join them against the Boeotians. At first they sent Lysander to them with a few soldiers, who, on entering Phocis, gathered an army, but later the king, Pausanias, was dispatched there with 6,000 soldiers. The Boeotians persuaded the Athenians to take part with them in the war, but at the time they took the field alone and found Haliartus under siege by Lysander and the Phocians. In the battle which followed, Lysander fell together with many Lacedaemonians and their allies. The entire body of other Boeotians speedily turned back from the pursuit, but some 200 Thebans advanced rather rashly into rugged terrain and were slain. This was called the Boeotian War. Pausanias, the king of the Lacedaemonians, on learning of the defeat, concluded a truce with the Boeotians and led his army back to the Peloponnesus. Conon, the admiral of the Persians, put the Athenians Hieronymus and Nicodemus in charge of the fleet and himself set forth, with intent to interview the king. He sailed along the coast of Cilicia, and when he had gone on to Thapsacus in Syria, he then took boat by the Euphrates River to Babylon. Here he met the king and promised that he would destroy the Lacedaemonians' naval power if the king would furnish him with such money and other supplies as his plan required. Artaxerxes approved Conon, honored him with rich gifts, and appointed a paymaster who should supply funds in abundance as Conon might assign them. He also gave him authority to take as his associate leader for the war any Persian he might choose. Conon selected the satrap Pharnabazus and then returned to the sea, having arranged everything to suit his purpose. At the close of this year, an Athenian Diophantus entered upon the archonship, and in Rome, in place of consuls, the consular magistracy was exercised by 6 military tribunes: Lucius Valerius, Marcus Furius, Quintus Servilius, and Quintus Sulpicius. After these men had assumed their magistracies, the Boeotians and Athenians, together with the Corinthians and the Argives, concluded an alliance with each other. It was their thought that, since the Lacedaemonians were hated by their allies because of their harsh rule, it would be an easy matter to overthrow their supremacy, given that the strongest states were of one mind. First of all, they set up a common council in Corinth, to which they sent representatives to form plans, and worked out in common the arrangements for the war. Then they dispatched ambassadors to the cities and caused many allies of the Lacedaemonians to withdraw from them, for at once all of Euboea and the Leucadians joined them, as well as the Acarnanians, Ambraciots, and the Chalcidians of Thrace. They also attempted to persuade the inhabitants of the Peloponnesus to revolt from the Lacedaemonians, but no one listened to them, for Sparta, lying as it does along the side of it, was a kind of citadel and fortress of the entire Peloponnesus. Medius, the lord of Larissa in Thessaly, was at war with Lycophron, the tyrant of Pherai, and when he asked for aid to be sent him, the council dispatched to him 2,000 soldiers. After the troops had arrived, Medius seized Pharsalus, in which there was a garrison of Lacedaemonians, and sold the inhabitants as booty. After this the Boeotians and Argives, parting company with Medius, seized Heraclea in Trachis, and on being admitted at night within the walls by certain persons, they put to the sword the Lacedaemonians whom they seized, but allowed the other Peloponnesians to leave with their possessions. They then summoned to the city the Trachinians whom the Lacedaemonians had banished from their homes, and gave them the city as their dwelling place, and indeed they were the most ancient settlers of this territory. After this Ismenias, the leader of the Boeotians, left the Argives in the city to serve as its garrison and himself persuaded the Aenianians and the Athamenes to revolt from the Lacedaemonians and gathered soldiers from among them and their allies. After he had recruited a little less than 6,000 men, he took the field against the Phocians. While he was taking up quarters in Neryx and Locris, which men say was the birthplace of Ajax, the people of the Phocians came against him in arms under the command of Alcisthenes the Laconian. A sharp and protracted battle followed, in which the Boeotians were the victors. Pursuing the fugitives until nightfall, they slew not many less than 1,000, but lost of their own troops in the battle about 500. After the pitched battle, both sides dismissed their armies to their native lands, and the members of the council in Corinth, since affairs were progressing as they desired, gathered to Corinth soldiers from all the cities, more than 15,000 infantry and about 500 cavalry. When the Lacedaemonians saw that the greatest cities of Greece were uniting against them, they voted to summon Agesilaus and his army from Asia. In the meantime, they gathered from their own levy and their allies 23,000 infantry and 500 cavalry and advanced to meet the enemy. The battle took place along the river Nemea, lasting until nightfall, and parts of both armies had the advantage, but of the Lacedaemonians and their allies 1,100 men fell, while of the Boeotians and their allies about 2,800. After Agesilaus had conveyed his army across from Asia to Europe, at first he was opposed by certain Thracians with a large force. These he defeated in battle, slaying the larger number of the barbarians. Then he made his way through Macedonia, passing through the same country as Xerxes did when he made his campaign against the Greeks. When Agesilaus had traversed Macedonia and Thessaly and made his way through the pass of Thermopylae, he continued. Conon the Athenian and Pharnabazus were in command of the king's fleet and were tarrying in Lorima of the Chersonesus with more than 90 triremes. When they learned that the enemy's naval forces were at Cnidus, they made preparations for battle. Peisander, the Lacedaemonian admiral, set out from Cnidus with 85 triremes and put in at Phiscus of the Chersonesus. On sailing from there he fell in with the king's fleet, and engaging the leading ships, he won the advantage over them, but when the Persians came to give aid with their triremes in close formation, all his allies fled to the land. But Peisander turned his own ship against them, believing ignoble flight to be disgraceful and unworthy of Sparta. After fighting brilliantly and slaying many of the enemy, in the end he was overcome, battling in a manner worthy of his native land. Conon pursued the Lacedaemonians as far as the land and captured 50 of their triremes. As for the crews, most of them leaped overboard and escaped by land, but about 500 were captured. The rest of the triremes found safety at Cnidus. Agesilaus enlisted more soldiers from the Peloponnesus and then advanced with his army against Boeotia, whereupon the Boeotians, together with their allies, at once set out to Chaeronea to meet him. In the battle which followed, the Thebans defeated the forces opposed to them and pursued them as far as their camp, but the others held out only a short time and then were forced by Agesilaus and his troops to take to flight. Therefore the Lacedaemonians, looking upon themselves as conquerors, set up a trophy and gave back the dead to the enemy under a truce. There fell of the Boeotians and their allies more than 600, but of the Lacedaemonians and their associates 350. Agesilaus, who had suffered many wounds, was taken to Delphi, where he looked after his physical needs. After the sea fight, Pharnabazus and Conon put out to sea with all their ships against the allies of the Lacedaemonians. First of all they induced the people of Kos to secede, and then those of Nisyros and of Teos. After this the Chians expelled their garrison and joined Conon, and similarly the Mytileneans and Ephesians and Erythraeans changed sides. Something like the same eagerness for change infected all the cities, of which some expelled their Lacedaemonian garrisons and maintained their freedom, while others attached themselves to Conon. As for the Lacedaemonians, from this time they lost the sovereignty of the sea. Conon, having decided to sail with the entire fleet to Attica, put out to sea, and after bringing over to his cause the islands of the Cyclades, he sailed against the island of Cythera. Mastering it at once on the first assault, he sent the Cytherians under a truce to Laconia, left an adequate garrison for the city, and sailed for Corinth. After putting in there, he discussed with the members of the council such points as they wished, made an alliance with them, left them money, and then sailed off to Asia. At this time Aripus, the king of the Macedonians, died of illness after a reign of 6 years, and was succeeded in the sovereignty by his son Pausanias, who ruled for 1 year. Theopompus of Chios ended with this year, and the Battle of Cnidus is Hellenistic history, which he wrote in Thrasybulus books. This historian began with the Battle of Cynossema, with which Thucydides ended his work, and covered in his account a period of 17 years. At the conclusion of the year, in Athens Eubulides was archon, and in Rome the consular magistracy was administered by 6 military tribunes, Lucius Sergius, Aulus Postumius, Publius Cornelius, and Quintus Manlius. At this time Conon, who held the command of the king's fleet, put in at the Piraeus with 80 triremes and promised the citizens to rebuild the fortifications of the city, for the walls of the Piraeus and the long walls had been destroyed in accordance with the terms the Athenians had concluded with the Lacedaemonians when they were reduced in the Peloponnesian War. Accordingly, Conon hired a multitude of skilled workers, and putting at their service the general run of his crews, he speedily rebuilt the larger part of the wall. For the Thebans too sent 500 skilled workers and masons, and some other cities also gave assistance. But Teribazus, who commanded the land forces in Asia, was envious of Conon's successes, and on the plea that Conon was using the king's armaments to win the cities for the Athenians, he lured him to Sardis, where he arrested him, threw him in chains, and remanded him to custody. In Corinth, certain men who favored a democracy, banding together while contests were being held in the theater, instituted a slaughter and filled the city with civil strife, and when the Argives gave them their support in their adventure, they put to the sword 120 of the citizens and drove 500 into exile. While the Lacedaemonians were making preparations to restore the exiles and gathering an army, the Athenians and Boeotians came to the aid of the murderers, in order that they might secure the adhesion of the city. The exiles, together with the Lacedaemonians and their allies, attacked Lycium and the dockyard by night and seized them by storm, and on the next day, when the troops of the city, which Iphicrates commanded, came out against them, a battle followed in which the Lacedaemonians were victorious and slew no small number of their opponents. After this the Boeotians and Athenians, and with them the Argives and Corinthians, came with all their forces to Lycium, and at the outset they laid siege to the place and forced their way into the corridor between the walls, but afterward the Lacedaemonians and the exiles put up a brilliant fight and forced out the Boeotians and all who were with them. They then, having lost about 1,000 soldiers, returned to the city. And since the Isthmian games were now at hand, there was a quarrel over who should conduct them. After much contention the Lacedaemonians had their way and saw to it that the exiles conducted festival. Since the severe fighting in the war took place for the most part about Corinth, it was called the Corinthian War, and it continued for 8 years. In Sicily the people of Rhegium, bringing the charge against Dionysius that in fortifying Messene he was making preparations against them, first of all offered asylum to those who were expelled by Dionysius and were active against him, and then settled in Mylae the surviving Naxians and Catanians, prepared an army, and dispatched as its general Halorus to lay siege to Messene. When Halorus made a reckless attack upon the Acropolis, the Messenians and the mercenaries of Dionysius, who were holding the city, closed ranks and advanced against him. In the battle that followed the Messenians were victorious and slew more than 500 of their opponents. Marching straightway against Mylae, they seized the city and let the Naxians who had been settled there go free under a truce. These, accordingly, departed to the Siculae and the Greek cities and made their dwellings some in one place and others in another. Dionysius, now that the regions about the straits had been brought to friendly terms with him, planned to lead an army against Rhegium, but he had trouble with the Siculae who held Tauromenium. Deciding, therefore, that it would be to his advantage to attack them first, he led out his forces against them, pitched a camp on the side toward Naxos, and persisted in the siege during the winter, in the belief that the Siculae would desert the hill since they had not been dwelling there long. The Siculae, however, had an ancient tradition, handed down from their ancestors, that these parts of the island had been the possession of the Siculae when Greeks first landed there and founded Naxos, expelling from that very hill the Siculae who were then dwelling on it. Maintaining, therefore, that they had only recovered territory that belonged to their fathers and were justly righting the wrongs which the Greeks had committed against their ancestors, they put forth every effort to hold the hill. While extraordinary rivalry was being displayed on both sides, the winter solstice occurred, and because of the consequent winter storms the area about the Acropolis was filled with snow. Thereupon Dionysius, who had discovered that the Siculi were careless in their guard of the Acropolis because of its strength and the unusual height of the wall, advanced on a moonless and stormy night against the loftiest sectors. After many difficulties, both because of the obstacles offered by the crags and because of the great depth of the snow, he occupied one peak, although his face was frosted and his vision impaired by the cold. After this, he broke through to the other side and led his army into the city. But when the Siculi came up in a body, the troops of Dionysius were thrust out, and Dionysius himself was struck on the corslet in the flight, sent scrambling, and barely escaped being taken alive. Since the Siculi pressed upon them from superior ground, more than 600 of Dionysius' troops were slain, and most of them lost their complete armor, while Dionysius himself saved only his corslet. After this disaster, the Acragantini and Messenians banished the partisans of Dionysius, asserted their freedom, and renounced their alliance with the tyrant. Pausanias, the king of the Lacedaemonians, was accused by his fellow citizens and went into exile after a reign of 14 years, and his son Agesipolis succeeded to the kingship and reigned for the same length of time as his father. Pausanias too, the king of the Macedonians, died after a reign of 1 year, being assassinated by Amyntas, who seized the kingship and reigned 24 years. At the conclusion of this year, in Athens Demostratus took over the archonship, and in Rome the cis magistracy was administered by 6 military tribunes: Lucius Titinius, Publius Licinius, Publius Malleus, Quintus Malleus, Gnaeus Genetius, and Lucius Attilius. After these magistrates had entered office, Magan, the Carthaginian general, was stationed in Sicily. He set about retrieving the Carthaginian cause after the disaster they had suffered, for he showed kindness to the subject cities and received the victims of Dionysius' wars. He also formed alliances with most of the Siculi and, after gathering armaments, launched an attack upon the territory of Messene. After ravaging the countryside and seizing much booty, he marched from that place and went into camp near the city of Abyssine, which was his ally. When Dionysius came up with his army, the forces drew up for battle, and after a sharp engagement Dionysius was the victor. The Carthaginians fled into the city after a loss of more than 800 men, while Dionysius withdrew for the time being to Syracuse, but after a few days he manned 100 triremes and set out against the regions. Arriving unexpectedly by night before the city, he put fire to the gates and set ladders against the walls. The regions, coming up in defense as they did at first in small numbers, endeavored to put out the flames, but later, when their general Halorus arrived and advised them to do just the opposite, they saved the city. For if they had put out the fire, they would not have been strong enough to prevent Dionysius from entering, being far too small a number, but by bringing firewood and timbers from the neighboring houses they made the flames higher, until the main body of their troops could assemble in arms and come to the defense. Dionysius, who had failed of his design, traversed the countryside, wasting it in flames and cutting down orchards, and then concluded a truce for a year and sailed off to Syracuse. The Greek inhabitants of Italy, when they saw the encroachments of Dionysius advancing as far as their own lands, formed an alliance among themselves and established a council. It was their hope to defend themselves with ease against Dionysius and to resist the neighboring Lucani, for these last were also at war with them at this time. The exiles who held Lycium in Corinthian territory, being admitted into the city in the night, endeavored to get possession of the walls, but when the troops of Iphicrates came up against them, they lost 300 of their number and fled back to the ship station. Some days later a contingent of the Lacedaemonian army was passing through Corinthian territory when Iphicrates and some of the allies in Corinth fell on them and slew the larger number. Iphicrates with his peltasts advanced against the territory of Phlius, and joining battle with the men of the city, he slew more than 300 of them. Then, when he advanced against Sicyon, the Sicyonians offered battle before their walls, but lost about 500 men and found refuge within their city. After these events had taken place, the Argives took up arms in full force and marched against Corinth, and after seizing the Acropolis and securing the city for themselves, they made the Corinthian territory Argive. The Athenian Iphicrates also had the design to seize the city, since it was advantageous for the control of Greece, but when the Athenian people opposed it, he resigned his position. The Athenians appointed Chabrias general in his place and sent him to Corinth. In Macedonia Amyntas, the father of Philip, was driven from his country by Illyrians who invaded Macedonia, and giving up hope for his crown, he made a present to the Olynthians of his territory which bordered on theirs. For the time being he lost his kingdom, but shortly he was restored by the Thessalians, recovered his crown, and ruled for 24 years. Some say, however, that after the expulsion of Amyntas the Macedonians were ruled by Argaeus for a period of 2 years, and that it was after that time that Amyntas recovered the kingship. The same year Satyrus, the son of Spartacus and king of Bosporus, died after a reign of 40 years, and his son Lycon succeeded him in the rulership for a period of 40 years. In Italy the Romans, who were in the 11th year of their siege of the Vans, appointed Marcus Furius to be dictator and Publius Cornelius to be master of the horse. These restored the spirit of the troops and captured Veii by constructing an underground passage. The city they reduced to slavery, selling the inhabitants with the other booty. The dictator then celebrated a triumph, and the Roman people, taking 1/10 of the spoil, made a gold bowl and dedicated to the oracle at Delphi. The ambassadors who were taking it fell in with pirates from the Lipari Islands, were all taken prisoners, and brought to Lipara. But Timesitheus, the general of the Liparians, on learning what had taken place, rescued the ambassadors, gave them back the vessel of gold, and sent them on their way to Delphi. The men who were conveying the bowl dedicated it in the treasury of the Massalians, and returned to Rome. Consequently, the Roman people, when they learned of this generous act of Timesitheus, honored him at once by conferring the right to public hospitality, and 137 years later, when they took Lipara from the Carthaginians, they relieved the descendants of Timesitheus of the payment of taxes and gave them freedom. When the year had ended, in Athens Philocles became archon, and in Rome the consular magistracy was assumed by 6 military tribunes, Publius and Cornelius, Caeso Fabius, Lucius Furius, Quintus Servilius, and Marcus Valerius, and this year the 97th Olympiad was celebrated, that in which Tereres was victor. In this year the Athenians chose Thrasybulus general and sent him to sea with 40 triremes. He sailed to Ionia, collected funds from the allies, and proceeded on his way, and while tarrying at the Chersonesus he made allies of Medicus and Suths, the kings of the Thracians. After some time he sailed from the Hellespont to Lesbos and anchored off the coast at Eresus. But strong winds arose and 23 triremes were lost. Getting off safe with the other ships he advanced against the cities of Lesbos, with the intention of winning them over, for they had all revolted with the exception of Mytilene. First he appeared before Methymna and joined battle with the men of the city, who were commanded by the Spartan Thrymachus. In a brilliant fight he slew not only Thrymachus himself but no small number of the Methymnians and shut up the rest of them within their walls. He also ravaged the territory of the Methymnians and received the surrender of Eresus and Antissa. After this he gathered ships from the Chian and Mytilenean allies and sailed to Rhodes. The Carthaginians, after a slow recovery from the disaster they had suffered at Syracuse, resolved to keep their hand in Sicilian affairs. Having decided upon war, they crossed over with only a few warships, but brought together troops from Libya and Sardinia as well as from the barbarians of Italy. The soldiers were all carefully supplied with equipment to which they were accustomed and brought over to Sicily, being no less than 80,000 in number and under the command of Magan. This commander accordingly made his way through the Sicily, detaching most of the cities from Dionysius, and went into camp in the territory of the Adrenians on the banks of the Chrysis River near the road that leads to Morgantina. For since he was unable to bring the Adrenians to enter an alliance with him, he refrained from marching farther, since he had news that the enemy had set out from Syracuse. Dionysius, on learning that the Carthaginians were making their way through the interior, speedily collected as many Syracusans and mercenaries as he could and set forth, having in all not less than 20,000 soldiers. When he came near the enemy he sent an embassy to Agerus, the lord of the Adrenians. This man possessed the strongest armament of any of the tyrants of Sicily at that time after Dionysius, since he was lord of practically all the neighboring fortified communities and ruled the city of the Adrenians, which was well peopled at that time, for it had no less than 20,000 citizens. There was also laid up on the Acropolis for this multitude which had been gathered together in the city a large store of money which Agerus had collected after he had murdered the wealthiest citizens. But Dionysius, after entering the city with a small company, persuaded Agerus to join him as a genuine ally and promised to make him a present of a large portion of neighboring territory if the war ended successfully. At the outset, then, Agerus readily provided the entire army of Dionysius with food and whatever else it needed, led forth his troops in a body, joined with Dionysius in the campaign, and fought together with him in the war against the Carthaginians. Magan, since he was encamped in hostile territory and was ever more and more in want of supplies, was at no little disadvantage, for the troops of Agirus, being familiar with the territory, held the advantage in laying ambushes and were continually cutting off the enemy's supplies. The Syracusans were for deciding the issue by battle as soon as possible, but Dionysius opposed them, saying that time and want would ruin the barbarians without fighting. Provoked to anger at this, the Syracusans deserted him. In his first concern, Dionysius proclaimed freedom for the slaves, but later, when the Carthaginians sent embassies to discuss peace, he negotiated with them, sent back the slaves to their masters, and made peace with the Carthaginians. The conditions were like the former, except that the Siculi were to be subject to Dionysius, and that he was to receive Tauromenium. After the conclusion of the treaty, Magan sailed off, and Dionysius, on taking possession of Tauromenium, banished most of the Siculi who were in it and selected and settled there the most suitable members of his own mercenary troops. Such was the state of affairs in Sicily, and in Italy the Romans pillaged the city of Faliscus of the tribe of the Fallaceae. At the close of the year, in Athens Nicotelles was archon, and in Rome the consular magistracy was administered by 3 military tribunes, Marcus Furius and Gaius Aemilius. After these magistrates had entered office, the Philo-Lacedaemonians among the Rhodians rose up against the party of the people and expelled from the city the partisans of the Athenians. When these banded together under arms and endeavored to maintain their interests, the allies of the Lacedaemonians got the upper hand, slaughtered many, and formally banished those who escaped. They also at once sent ambassadors to Lacedaemon to get aid, fearing that some of the citizens would rise in revolt. The Lacedaemonians dispatched to them 7 triremes and 3 men to take charge of affairs, Eudocimus, Philoctetus, and Diphilus. They first reached Samos and brought that city over from the Athenians, and then they put in at Rhodes and assumed the oversight of affairs there. The Lacedaemonians, now that their affairs were prospering, resolved to get control of the sea, and after gathering a naval force they again little by little began to get the upper hand over their allies. So they put in at Samos and Cnidus and Rhodes, and gathering ships from every place and enrolling the choicest marines, they equipped lavishly 27 triremes. Agesilaus, the king of the Lacedaemonians, on hearing that the Argives were engaged about Corinth, led forth the Lacedaemonians in full force, with the exception of 1 regiment. He visited every part of Argolis, pillaged the homesteads, cut down the trees over the countryside, and then returned to Sparta. In Cyprus, Evagrius of Salamis, who was of most noble birth, since he was descended from the founders of the city, but had previously been banished because of some factional quarrels and had later returned in company with a small group, drove out Abdemon of Tyre, who was lord of the city and a friend of the king of the Persians. When he took control of the city, Evagrius was at first king only of Salamis, the largest and strongest of the cities of Cyprus, but when he soon acquired great resources and mobilized an army, he set out to make the whole island his own. Some of the cities he subdued by force, and others he won over by persuasion. While he easily gained control of the other cities, the peoples of Almathus, Soli, and Citium resisted him with arms and dispatched ambassadors to Artaxerxes the king of the Persians to get his aid. They accused Evagrius of having slain King Agirus, an ally of the Persians, and promised to join the king in acquiring the island for him. The king, not only because he did not wish Evagrius to grow any stronger, but also because he appreciated the strategic position of Cyprus and its great naval strength whereby it would be able to protect Asia in front, decided to accept the alliance. He dismissed the ambassadors and for himself sent letters to the cities situated on the sea and to their commanding satraps to construct triremes and with all speed to make ready everything the fleet might need, and he commanded Hecatomnus, the ruler of Curia, to make war upon Evagrius. Hecatomnus traversed the cities of the upper satrapies and crossed over to Cyprus in strong force. Such was the state of affairs in Asia. In Italy, the Romans concluded peace with the Falici and waged war for the 4th time on the Equi. They also sent a colony to Sutrium, but were expelled by the enemy from the city of Verrugo. At the close of this year, Demostratus was archon in Athens, and in Rome, the consuls Lucius Lucretius and Servilius took office. At this time Artaxerxes sent Struthas as general to the coast with an army to make war on the Lacedaemonians, and the Spartans, when they learned of his arrival, dispatched Thybron as general to Asia. Thybron seized the stronghold of Ionda and a high mountain, Cornisus, 40 stades, from Ephesus. He then advanced with 8,000 soldiers together with the troops gathered from Asia, pillaging the king's territory. Strutaz, with a strong force of barbarian cavalry, 5,000 hoplites, and more than 20,000 light-armed troops, pitched his camp not far from the Lacedaemonians. Eventually, when Thybron once set out with a detachment of his troops and had seized much booty, Strutaz attacked and slew him in battle, killed the larger number of his troops, and took captive others. A few found safety in Nidinium, an outpost. Thrasybulus, the Athenian general, went with his fleet from Lesbos to Aspendus and moored his triremes in the Eurymedon river. Although he had received contributions from the Aspendians, some of the soldiers, nevertheless, pillaged the countryside. When night came, the Aspendians, angered at such unfairness, attacked the Athenians and slew both Thrasybulus and a number of the others, whereupon the captains of the Athenian vessels, greatly alarmed, speedily manned the ships and sailed off to Rhodes. Since this city was in revolt, they joined the exiles who had seized a certain outpost and waged war on the men who held the city. When the Athenians learned of the death of their general Thrasybulus, they sent out Agerius as general. Such was the state of affairs in Asia. In Sicily, Dionysius, the tyrant of the Syracusans, with intent to annex the Greeks of Italy as well to the overlordship that he held in the island, postponed the general war against them to another time. He judged rather that it was good policy to attack first the city of the regions, because it was the advanced bastion of Italy, and so set out from Syracuse with his army. He had 20,000 infantry, 1,000 cavalry, and 120 ships of war. He crossed with his troops to the borders of Locris and from there made his way through the interior, cutting down the trees and burning and destroying the territory of the regions. His fleet sailed along to the other districts upon the sea, and he encamped with his entire army at the strait. When the Italians learned that Dionysius had crossed the sea to attack Rhegium, they dispatched 60 ships from Croton, with intent to hand them over to the regions. While this fleet was cruising on the high sea, Dionysius sailed against them with 50 ships, and when the fleet fled to land, he pressed his attack no less vigorously and began to make fast and haul off the ships that were lying offshore. Since the 60 triremes were in danger of being captured, the regions came to their aid in full force and held Dionysius off from the land by the multitude of their missiles. When a heavy storm arose, the regions hauled up the ships high and dry on the land, but Dionysius lost 7 ships in the heavy gale and together with them no fewer than 1,500 men. Since the sailors were cast ashore together with their ships on region territory, many of them were taken prisoner by the regions. Dionysius, who was on a quinquereme and many times narrowly escaped foundering, about midnight barely found safety in the harbor of Messene. Since the winter season had already come, he drew up terms of alliance with the Lucani and led his forces back to Syracuse. After this, when the Lucanians overran the territory of Thurii, the Thurians sent word to their allies to gather to them speedily under arms. For the Greek cities of Italy had an agreement among themselves to the effect that if any city's territory was being plundered by the Lucanians, they should all come to its aid, and that if any city's army did not take up a position to give aid, the generals of that city should be put to death. Consequently, when the Thurians dispatched messengers to the cities to tell of the approach of the enemy, they all made ready to march. But the Thurians, who were first off the mark in their actions, did not wait for the troops of their allies, but set forth against the Lucanians with above 14,000 infantry and about 1,000 cavalry. The Lucanians, on hearing of the approach of the enemy, withdrew to their own territory, and the Thurians, falling in haste upon Lucania, captured the first outpost and gathered much booty, thus taking the bait, as it were, for their own destruction. For having become puffed with pride at their success, they advanced with light concern through some narrow and sheer paths, in order to lay siege to the prosperous city of Laos. When they had arrived at a certain plain surrounded by lofty hills and precipitous cliffs, thereupon the Lucanians with their entire army cut them off from retreat to their native soil. Making their appearance, which was quite unexpected and unconcealed, on the height, they filled the Greeks with dismay, both because of the great size of the army and because of the difficulty of the terrain, for the Lucanians had at the time 30,000 infantry and no less than 4,000 cavalry. When the Greeks were to their surprise caught in such hopeless peril as we have described, the barbarians descended into the plain. A battle took place and there fell of the Italian Greeks, overwhelmed as they were by the multitude of the Lucanians, more than 10,000 men, since the Lucanians gave orders to save no one alive. Of the survivors some fled to a height on the sea, and others, seeing warships sailing toward them and thinking they belonged to the regions, fled in a body to the sea and swam out to the triremes. The approaching fleet belonged to Dionysius the tyrant, under the command of his brother Leptines, and had been sent to the aid of the Lacanians. Leptines received the swimmers kindly, set them on land, and persuaded the Lacanians to accept a mina of silver for each captive, the number of whom was over 1,000. Leptines went surety for the ransom money, reconciled the Italian Greeks with the Lacanians, and persuaded them to conclude peace. He won great acclaim among the Italian Greeks, having settled the war, as he had, to his own advantage, but without any profit to Dionysius. For Dionysius hoped that, if the Italian Greeks were embroiled in war with the Lacanians, he might appear and easily make himself master of affairs in Italy, but if they were rid of such a dangerous war, his success would be difficult. Consequently, he relieved Leptines of his command and appointed Theorides, his other brother, commander of the fleet. Subsequent to these events, the Romans portioned out in allotments the territory of the Vaeans, giving each holder 4 plethra, but according to other accounts, 28. The Romans were at war with the Equi and took by storm the city of Liphlis, and they began war upon the people of Velitri, who had revolted. Satricum also revolted from the Romans, and they dispatched a colony to Circeii. When the year had ended, in Athens Antipater was archon, and in Rome Lucius Valerius and Aulus Malleus administered the consular magistracy. This year Dionysius, the lord of the Syracusans, openly indicated his design of an attack on Italy and set forth from Syracuse with a most formidable force. He had more than 20,000 infantry, some 3,000 cavalry, 40 ships of war, and not less than 300 vessels transporting food supplies. On arriving at Messene on the 5th day, he rested his troops in the city, while he dispatched his brother Theorides with 30 ships to the islands of the Liparrians, since he had learned that 10 ships of the regions were in those waters. Theorides, sailing forth and coming upon the 10 region ships in a place favorable to his purpose, seized the ships together with their crews and speedily returned to Dionysius at Messene. Dionysius threw the prisoners in chains and turned them over to the custody of the Messenians. Then he transported his army to Colonia, laid siege to the city, advanced his siege engines, and launched frequent assaults. When the Greeks of Italy learned that the armaments of Dionysius were starting to move across the strait which separated them, they in turn mustered their forces. Since the city of the Crotoniates was the most heavily populated and had the largest number of exiles from Syracuse, they gave over to them the command of the war, and the people of Croton gathered troops from every quarter and chose as general Halorus the Syracusan. Since this man had been banished by Dionysius and was considered by all to possess action and enterprise, it was believed that he could be best trusted, because of his hatred, to lead a war against the tyrant. When all the allies had gathered in Croton, Halorus disposed them to his liking and advanced with the entire army toward Colonia. He calculated that he would by his appearance at the same time both relieve the siege and also be in combat with the enemy worn out by their daily assaults. In all, he had about 25,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. The Italian Greeks had accomplished the major part of their march and were encamped on the Elaporus River when Dionysius drew off from the city and advanced to meet them. Now Halorus was in the van of his army with 500 of choicest troops, and Dionysius, as it happened, was encamped 40 stades from the enemy. On learning from his scouts that the enemy was near, he roused his army at early light and led it forward. Meeting at daybreak the troops of Halorus, who were few in number, he engaged them in unexpected battle, and since he had his army ready for combat, he gave the enemy not a moment to recover themselves. Though Halorus found himself in desperate straits, he withstood the attackers with what troops he had, while he sent some of his friends to the camp, urging them to rush up the main body of soldiers. These speedily carried out their orders, and when the Italian Greeks learned of the danger facing their general and his troops, they came to their aid on the run. Meanwhile Dionysius, with his troops in close order, surrounded Halorus and his men and slew them almost to a man, though they offered a gallant resistance. Since the Italian Greeks in their haste entered the fighting in scattered groups, the Sicilian Greeks, who kept their lines intact, experienced no difficulty in overcoming the enemy. Nevertheless, the Greeks of Italy maintained the fight for some time, although they saw their comrades falling in great numbers. But when they learned of the death of their general, while being greatly hampered as they fell foul of one another in their confusion, then at last they completely lost spirit and turned in flight. Many were killed in their route across the plain, but the main body made a safe retreat to a hill, which was strong enough to withstand a siege, but had no water and could be easily contained by the enemy. Dionysius invested the hill and bivouacked under arms that day and through the night, giving careful attention to the watches. The next day the beleaguered suffered severely from the heat and lack of water. They then sent a herald to Dionysius inviting him to accept ransom. He, however, did not preserve moderation in his success, but ordered them to lay down their arms and put themselves at the disposal of their conqueror. This was a harsh order, and they held out for some time, but when they were overborne by physical necessity, they surrendered about the 8th hour, their bodies being now weakened. Dionysius took a staff and struck it on the ground while numbering the prisoners as they descended, and they amounted to more than 10,000. All men were apprehensive of his brutality, but on the contrary he showed himself most kindly, for he let the prisoners go subject to no authority without ransom, concluded peace with most of the cities, and left them independent. In return for this, he received the approval of those he had favored and was honored with gold crowns, and men believed that this would probably be the finest act of his life. Dionysius now advanced against Rhegium and prepared to lay siege to the city with his army because of the slight he had received in connection with his offer of marriage. Deep distress gripped the regions, since they had neither allies nor an army that was a match for him in battle, and they knew, furthermore, that if the city were taken, neither pity nor entreaty would be left them. Therefore, they decided to dispatch ambassadors to entreat him to deal moderately with them and to urge him to make no decision against them beyond what became a human being. Dionysius required 300 talents of them, took all their ships, which amounted to 70, and ordered the delivery of 100 hostages. When all these had been turned over, he set out against Colonia. The inhabitants of this city he transplanted to Syracuse, gave them citizenship, and allowed them exemption from taxes for 5 years. He then leveled the city to the ground and gave the territory of the Coloniates to the Locrians. The Romans, after taking the city of Lyphoequa from the people of the Equi, held, in accordance with the vows of the consuls, great games in honor of Zeus. At the close of the year, in Athens Persian was archon, and in Rome 4 military tribunes took over the consular magistracy: Lucius Lucretius, Servius Sulpicius, Gaius Emilius, and Gaius Rufus, and the 98th Olympiad was celebrated, that in which Sosippus of Athens was the victor. When these men had entered office, Dionysius, the lord of the Syracusans, advanced with his army to Hipponium, removed its inhabitants to Syracuse, razed the city to the ground, and apportioned its territory to the Locrians. For he was continuously set upon doing the Locrians favors for the marriage they had agreed to, whereas he studied revenge upon the regions for their affront with respect to the offer of kinship. For on the occasion when he sent ambassadors to them to ask them to grant him in marriage a maiden of their city, the regions replied to the ambassadors by action of the people, we are told, that the only maiden they would agree to his marrying would be the daughter of their public executioner. Angered because of this, and believing that he had been grossly insulted, he was bent on getting revenge upon them. Indeed, the peace he had concluded with them in the preceding year had come from no hankering on his part for friendly relations, but was designed to strip them of their naval water, which consisted of 70 triremes. For he believed that if the city were cut off from aid by sea, he could easily reduce it by siege. Consequently, while loitering in Italy, he kept seeking a plausible excuse whereby he might seem to have broken the truce, without prejudice to his own standing. Dionysius now led his forces to the strait and made preparations to cross over. And first he asked the regions to provide him with supplies for sail, promising that he would promptly return from Syracuse what they had given. He made this request in order that men should think that, if they did not provide the food, he would be justified in seizing the city, whereas if they did, he believed their food would run out, and by sitting down before the city he would speedily master it by starvation. The regions, suspecting nothing of this, at first supplied them lavishly with food for several days, but when he kept extending his stay, at one time claiming illness and at another offering other excuses, they suspected what he had in mind and no longer furnished his army with supplies. Dionysius, pretending now to be angered at this, returned the hostages to the regions, laid siege to the city, and launched daily assaults upon it. He also constructed a great multitude of siege weapons of unbelievable size, by which he rocked the walls in his determination to take the city by storm. The regions chose Phaeton as general, armed all who could bear arms, gave close concern to their watches, and, as opportunity arose, sallied out and burned the enemy's siege engines. Fighting brilliantly as they did for their fatherland on many occasions before the walls, they roused the anger of the enemy, and although they lost many of their own troops, they also slew no small number of the Sicilian Greeks. And it happened that Dionysius himself was struck by a lance in the groin and barely escaped death, recovering with difficulty from the wound. The siege wore on because of the unsurpassable zeal the regions displayed to maintain their freedom, but Dionysius held his armaments to the daily assaults and would not give up the task he had originally proposed to himself. The Olympic Games were at hand, and Dionysius dispatched to the contest several four-horse teams, which far surpassed all others in swiftness, and also pavilions for the festive occasion, which were interwoven with gold and embellished with expensive cloth of gay and varied colors. He also sent the best professional reciters that they might present his poems in the gathering and thus win glory for the name of Dionysius, for he was madly addicted to poetry. In charge of all this, he sent along his brother Theorides. When Theorides arrived at the gathering, he was a center of attraction for the beauty of the pavilions and the large number of four-horse teams, and when the reciters began to present the poems of Dionysius, at first the multitude thronged together because of the pleasing voices of the actors, and all were filled with wonder. But on second consideration, when they observed how poor his verses were, they laughed Dionysius to scorn and went so far to their rejection that some of them even ventured to rifle the tents. Indeed, the orator Lysias, who was at that time in Olympia, urged the multitude not to admit to the sacred festival the representatives from a most impious tyranny, and at this time he delivered his Olympiacus. In the course of the contest, chance brought it about that some of Dionysius' chariots left the course and others collided among themselves and were wrecked. Likewise, the ship, which was on its way to Sicily carrying the representatives from the games, was wrecked by strong winds near Taras in Italy. Consequently, the sailors who got safe to Syracuse spread the story throughout the city. We are told that the badness of the verses caused the ill success, not only of the reciters, but of the teams and of the ship with them. When Dionysius learned of the ridicule that had been heaped upon his verses, his flatterers told him that every fair accomplishment is first an object of envy and then of admiration. He therefore did not give up his devotion to writing. The Romans fought a battle at Geraseum with the Volscians and slew great numbers of the enemy. At the conclusion of these events the year came to an end, and among the Athenians Theodotus was archon, and in Rome the consular might was held by 6 military tribunes, Quintus Ciso Sulpicius, Enus Ciso Fabius, Quintus Servilius, and Publius Cornelius. After these men had entered office, the Lacedaemonians, who were hard put to it by their double war, that against the Greeks and that against the Persians, dispatched their admiral Antalcidas to Artaxerxes to treat for peace. Antalcidas discussed as well as he could the circumstances of the mission, and the king agreed to make peace on the following terms: the Greek cities of Asia are subject to the king, but all the other Greeks shall be independent, and upon those who refuse compliance and do not accept these terms I shall make war through the aid of those who consent to them. Now the Lacedaemonians consented to the terms and offered no opposition, but the Athenians and Thebans and some of the other Greeks were deeply concerned that the cities of Asia should be left in the lurch. But since they were not by themselves a match in war, they consented of necessity and accepted the peace. The king, now that his difference with the Greeks was settled, made ready his armaments for the war. Great Cyprus. For Evagrius had got possession of almost the whole of Cyprus and gathered strong armaments, because Artaxerxes was distracted by the war against the Greeks. It was about the 11th month of Dionysius's siege of Rhegium, and since he had cut off relief from every direction, the inhabitants of the city were faced by a terrible dearth of the necessities of life. We are told, indeed, that at the time a medimnus of wheat among the regions cost 5 minas. So reduced were they by lack of food that at first they ate their horses and other beasts of burden, then fed upon boiled skins and leather, and finally they would go out from the city and eat the grass near the walls like so many cattle. To such an extent did the demand of nature compel the wants of man to turn for their satisfaction to the food of dumb animals. When Dionysius learned what was taking place, far from showing mercy to those who were perforce suffering beyond man's endurance, on the contrary he brought in cattle to clear the place of the green stuff, with the result that it was completely stripped. Consequently the regions, overcome by their excessive hardships, surrendered their city to the tyrant, giving him complete power over their lives. Within the city Dionysius found heaps of dead who had perished from lack of food, and the living too whom he captured were like dead men and weakened in body. He got together more than 6,000 captives, and the multitude he sent off to Syracuse with orders that those who could pay as ransom a mina of silver should be freed, but to sell as slaves those who were unable to raise that sum. Dionysius seized Phaeton, the general of the regions, and drowned his son in the sea, but Phaeton himself he had first bound on his loftiest siege engines, wreaking a vengeance upon him such as is to be seen upon the stage of tragedy. He also sent one of his servants to tell him that Dionysius had drowned his son in the sea the day before, to whom Phaeton replied, "He has been more fortunate than his father by one day." After this Dionysius had him led about the city under flogging and subjected to every indignity, a herald accompanying him and announcing that Dionysius was inflicting this unusual vengeance upon the man because he had persuaded the city to undertake the war. But Phaeton, who had shown himself a brave general during the siege and had won approval for all his other qualities, endured his mortal punishment with no low-born spirit. Rather he preserved his spirit undaunted and cried out that he was punished because he would not betray the city to Dionysius, and that heaven would soon visit such punishment upon Dionysius himself. The courage of the man aroused sympathy even among the soldiers of Dionysius, and some of them began to protest. Dionysius, fearing that some of the soldiers might make bold to snatch Phaeton out of his hands, ceased to punish him and drowned the unfortunate men at sea together with his near of kin. So this man suffered monstrous tortures unworthy of his merits. He won many of the Greeks to grieve for him at the time and many poets to lament the sad story of his reversal of fortune thereafter. At the time that Dionysius was besieging Rhegium, the Celts who had their homes in the regions beyond the Alps streamed through the passes in great strength and seized the territory that lay between the Apennine Mountains and the Alps, expelling the Tyrrhenians who dwelt there. These, according to some, were colonists from the 12 cities of Tyrrhenia, but others state that before the Trojan War Pelasgians fled from Thessaly to escape the flood of Deucalion's time and settled in this region. Now it happened, when the Celts divided up the territory by tribes, that those known as the Senones received the area which lay farthest from the mountains and along the sea. But since this region was scorching hot, they were distressed and eager to move, hence they armed their younger men and sent them out to seek a territory where they might settle. Now they invaded Tyrrhenia, and being in number some 30,000, they sacked the territory of the Clyseni. At this very time, the Roman people sent ambassadors into Tyrrhenia to spy out the army of the Celts. The ambassadors arrived at Clusium, and when they saw that a battle had been joined, with more valor than wisdom they joined the men of Clusium against their besiegers, and one of the ambassadors was successful in killing a rather important commander. When the Celts learned of this, they dispatched ambassadors to Rome to demand the person of the envoy who had thus commenced an unjust war. The Senate at first sought to persuade the envoys of the Celts to accept money in satisfaction of the injury, but when they would not consider this, it voted to surrender the accused. But the father of the man to be surrendered, who was also one of the military tribunes with consular power, appealed the judgment to the people, and since he was a man of influence among the masses, he persuaded them to void the decision of the Senate. Now in the times previous to this, the people had followed the Senate in all matters. With this occasion they first began to rescind decisions of that body. The ambassadors of the Celts returned to their camp and reported the reply of the Romans. At this they were greatly angered and, adding an army from their fellow tribesmen, they marched swiftly upon Rome itself, numbering more than 70,000 men. The military tribunes of the Romans, exercising their special power, when they heard of the advance of the Celts, armed all the men of military age. They then marched out in full force and, crossing the Tiber, led their troops for 80 stades along the river, and at news of the approach of the Galatians they drew up the army for battle. Their best troops, to the number of 24,000, they set in a line from the river as far as the hills, and on the highest hills they stationed the weakest. The Celts deployed their troops in a long line and, whether by fortune or design, stationed their choicest troops on the hills. The trumpets on both sides sounded the charge at the same time, and the armies joined in battle with great clamor. The elite troops of the Celts, who were opposed to the weakest soldiers of the Romans, easily drove them from the hills. Consequently, as these fled in masses to the Romans on the plain, the ranks were thrown into confusion and fled in dismay before the attack of the Celts. Since the bulk of the Romans fled along the river and impeded one another by reason of their disorder, the Celts were not behindhand in slaying again and again those who were last in line. Hence the entire plain was strewn with dead. Of the men who fled to the river, the bravest attempted to swim across with their arms, prizing their armor as highly as their lives, but since the stream ran strong, some of them were borne down to their death by the weight of the arms, and some, after being carried along for some distance, finally and after great effort got off safe. But since the enemy pressed them hard and was making a great slaughter along the river, most of the survivors threw away their arms and swam across the Tiber. The Celts, though they had slain great numbers on the bank of the river, nevertheless did not desist from the zest for glory, but showered javelins upon the swimmers, and since many missiles were hurled and men were massed in the river, those who threw did not miss their mark. So it was that some died at once from mortal blows, and others, who were wounded only, were carried off unconscious because of loss of blood and the swift current. When such disaster befell, the greater part of the Romans who escaped occupied the city of Veii, which had lately been razed by them, fortified the place as well as they could, and received the survivors of the rout. A few of those who had swum the river fled without their arms to Rome and reported that the whole army had perished. When word of such misfortunes as we have described was brought to those who had been left behind in the city, everyone fell into despair, for they saw no possibility of resistance, now that all their youth had perished, and to flee with their children and wives was fraught with the greatest danger since the enemy were close at hand. Now many private citizens fled with their households to neighboring cities, but the city magistrates, encouraging the populace, issued orders for them to bring speedily to the Capitoline grain and every other necessity. When this had been done, both the Acropolis and the Capitoline were stored not only with supplies of food but with silver and gold and the costliest raiment, since the precious possessions had been gathered from over the whole city into one place. They gathered such valuables as they could and fortified the place we have mentioned during a respite of 3 days. For the Celts spent the first day cutting off, according to their custom, the heads of the dead. And for 2 days they lay encamped before the city, for when they saw the walls deserted and yet heard the noise made by those who were transferring their most useful possessions to the Acropolis, they suspected that the Romans were planning a trap for them. But on the 4th day, after they had learned the true state of affairs, they broke down the gates and pillaged the city except for a few dwellings on the Palatine. After this they delivered daily assaults on strong positions, without, however, inflicting any serious hurt upon their opponents and with the loss of many of their own troops. Nevertheless, they did not relax their ardor, expecting that, even if they did not conquer by force, they would wear down the enemy in the course of time, when the necessities of life had entirely given out. While the Romans were in such throes, the neighboring Tyrrhenians advanced and made a raid with a strong army on the territory of the Romans, capturing many prisoners and not a small amount of booty. But the Romans who had fled to Veii, falling unexpectedly upon the Tyrrhenians, put them to flight, took back the booty, and captured their camp. Having got possession of arms in abundance, they distributed them among the unarmed, and they also gathered men from the countryside and armed them, since they intended to relieve the siege of the soldiers who had taken refuge on the Capitoline. While they were at a loss how they might reveal their plans to the besieged, since the Celts had surrounded them with strong forces, a certain Cominius Pontius undertook to get the cheerful news to the men on the Capitoline. Starting out alone and swimming the river by night, he got unseen to a cliff of the Capitoline that was hard to climb and, hauling himself up it with difficulty, told the soldiers on the Capitoline about the troops that had been collected in Veii and how they were watching for an opportunity and would attack the Celts. Then, descending by the way he had mounted and swimming the Tiber, he returned to Veii. The Celts, when they observed the tracks of one who had recently climbed up, made plans to ascend at night by the same cliff. Consequently, about the middle of the night, while the guards were neglectful of their watch because of the strength of the place, some Celts started an ascent of the cliff. They escaped detection by the guards, but the sacred geese of Hera, which were kept there, noticed the climbers and set up a cackling. The guards rushed to the place, and the Celts, deterred, did not dare proceed farther. A certain Marcus Malleus, a man held in high esteem, rushing to the defense of the place, cut off the hand of the climber with his sword and, striking him on the breast with his shield, rolled him from the cliff. In like manner, the second climber met his death, whereupon the rest all quickly turned in flight. But since the cliff was precipitous, they were all hurled headlong and perished. As a result of this, when the Romans sent ambassadors to negotiate a peace, they were persuaded, upon receipt of 1,000 pounds of gold, to leave the city and to withdraw from Roman territory. The Romans, now that their houses had been razed to the ground and the majority of their citizens slain, gave permission to anyone who wished to build a home in any place he chose, and supplied him at state expense with roof tiles, and up to the present time these are known as public tiles. Since every man naturally built his home where it suited his fancy, the result was that the streets of the city were narrow and crooked. Consequently, when the population increased in later days, it was impossible to straighten the streets. Some also say that the Roman matrons, because they contributed their gold ornaments to the common safety, received from the people as a reward the right to ride through the city in chariots. While the Romans were in a weakened condition because of the misfortune we have described, the Volscians went to war against them. Accordingly, the Roman military tribunes enrolled soldiers, took the field with their army, and pitched camp on the Campus Martius, as it is called, 200 stades distant from Rome. Since the Volscians lay over against them with a larger force and were assaulting the camp, the citizens in Rome, fearing for the safety of those in the encampment, appointed Marcus Furius dictator. These armed all the men of military age and marched out during the night. At daybreak they caught the Volscians as they were assaulting the camp, and appearing on their rear easily put them to flight. When the troops in the camp then sallied forth, the Volscians were caught in the middle and cut down almost to a man. Thus a people that passed for powerful in former days was by this disaster reduced to the weakest among the neighboring tribes. After the battle the dictator, on hearing that Bola was being besieged by the Equilani, who are now called the Equicoli, led forth his troops and slew most of the besieging army. From here he marched to the territory of Sutrium, a Roman colony, which the Tyrrhenians had forcibly occupied. Falling unexpectedly upon the Tyrrhenians, he slew many of them and recovered the city for the people of Sutrium. The Gauls on their way from Rome laid siege to the city of Vitium, which was an ally of the Romans. The dictator attacked them, slew the larger number of them, and got possession of all their baggage, included in which was the gold which they had received for Rome and practically all the booty which they had gathered in the seizure of the city. Despite the accomplishment of such great deeds, envy on the part of the tribunes prevented his celebrating a triumph. There are some, however, who state that he celebrated a triumph for his victory over the Tuscans in a chariot drawn by 4 white horses, for which the people 2 years later fined him a large sum of money. But we shall recur to this in the appropriate period of time. Those Celts who had passed into Iapygia turned back through the territory of the Romans, but soon thereafter the Syrii made a crafty attack on them by night and cut all of them to pieces in the Trojan plain. The historian Callisthenes began his history with the peace of this year between the Greeks and Artaxerxes, the king of the Persians. His account embraced a period of 30 years and 10 books, and he closed the last book of his history with the seizure of the Temple of Delphi by Philomelus the Phocian. But for our part, since we have arrived at the peace between the Greeks and Artaxerxes, and at the threat to Rome offered by the Gauls, we shall make this the end of this book, as we proposed at the beginning. End of Book 14.